What if the first language wasn't spoken at all? What if, before words carved air into meaning, before vowels rolled across tongues and consonants clicked behind teeth, there existed another way, older, deeper, resonating not through the fragile medium of air, but through bone itself? Imagine holding a flute carved from the femur of a cave bear. Your fingers rest where other fingers rested 40,000 years ago. The bone is smooth, worn by hands that knew cold like we cannot imagine, hands that shaped stone and tamed fire. You bring it to your lips. You blow. And the sound that emerges is not what you expect. It is perfect. Too perfect. The harmonics align with a precision that shouldn't exist in a world without mathematics, without frequency analysis, without the tools we believe necessary to understand sound. Yet here it is, this ancient instrument breathing notes that match the resonant frequencies of the human skull, the chest cavity, the inner ear. How did they know? This is not a question we ask lightly. This is the kind of question that, once posed, changes the shape of everything we thought we understood about our ancestors. Because if they knew this, if they understood resonance at a level we're only now rediscovering, then what else did they know? What else have we forgotten? If you're drawn to the kind of history that hums beneath the surface of textbooks, the kind that vibrates in bone rather than ink, consider staying with us. Subscribe only if you're ready to listen to what the past whispers when no one else is listening. And tell me in the comments below where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a city where sound never stops? Or somewhere quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat? Let's begin where all good mysteries begin, with something we cannot explain. In the Geisenklostral cave in Germany, archaeologists discovered flutes made from bird bone and mammoth ivory, dated to approximately 42,000 years ago. These are among the oldest musical instruments ever found. But when researchers analyzed them, when they measured the holes, calculated the ratios, tested the frequencies they produced, they found something unsettling. The instruments were not crude. They were not experimental. They were engineered. The spacing of the holes creates intervals that match what we call the pentatonic scale, a musical structure found independently across virtually every human culture on Earth. But more than that, the frequencies these flutes produce align almost perfectly with the resonant frequencies of the human body. Our skulls vibrate most efficiently at around 160 to 200 Hz. Our chest cavities at 50 to 100 Hz. The bones of our inner ear, those tiny hammers and anvils that translate vibration into what we call hearing, respond most sensitively to frequencies between 2000 to 5000 Hz. These ancient flutes produce all of these frequencies. Coincidence, we might say, natural trial and error over generations. But then we find more. In caves across Europe, in the painted chambers of Lascaux and Altamira, researchers have discovered that the images are not randomly placed. The most elaborate paintings, the bison, the horses, the mysterious handprints, cluster in the areas of the cave where sound resonates most powerfully. Strike a drum in these chambers and the walls themselves seem to answer. The echoes don't simply bounce back. They linger, they transform, they create harmonics that weren't in the original sound. And these resonant points, these sweet spots of acoustic power, are exactly where our ancestors chose to paint their most sacred images. Were they listening to the caves before they painted them? Were they finding the places where sound became something more than sound? At Newgrange in Ireland, a passage tomb older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, the chamber is constructed with such precision that it amplifies and focuses sound in ways that seem almost impossible for a culture we believe possessed no advanced mathematical knowledge. Drums played in that chamber produce frequencies that can induce altered states of consciousness. They can synchronize the brain waves of everyone present, creating what modern neuroscience calls neural entrainment. Multiple minds literally vibrating together. And they built this 5,000 years ago. But let's go deeper. Let's go beyond the instruments, beyond the chambers, into the body itself. In the 1990s, a researcher named Margot Jusset began studying the effects of low-frequency vibration on human bone tissue. She was investigating medical applications, treatments for osteoporosis, methods to stimulate bone growth. What she found was that certain frequencies, particularly those between 20 to 50 Hz, caused bones to vibrate in ways that stimulated not just physical growth but neural responses. The bones were talking to the brain. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say the bones were talking through the brain, because the vibrations didn't stay in the skeletal system. They propagated through the body's entire structure, creating waves that synchronized neural activity across different regions of the brain simultaneously. In controlled studies, subjects exposed to these frequencies reported strange experiences. Feelings of presence, the sense that someone was nearby, even in an empty room, vivid visual hallucinations, and perhaps most intriguingly, the overwhelming feeling that they were receiving information, not hearing words but understanding meaning directly. What if this wasn't a medical curiosity? What if this was an echo of something ancient? Consider this. The human body is approximately 60% water, but our bones are only about 10% water. The rest is crystalline matrix, minerals arranged in precise structures that respond to vibration like tuning forks. When you speak, when you hum, when you make any sound, your bones vibrate. We feel this unconsciously, but we can prove it consciously by placing a finger on our skull while we speak. That vibration travels. It moves through the skeletal structure faster than sound moves through air. It reaches the inner ear not through the eardrum, but through the bones themselves, a pathway called bone conduction, which we now use in modern hearing aids and underwater communication devices. But here's what we rarely consider. Bone conduction is more efficient than air conduction. The sound is clearer, less distorted, and it carries frequencies that airborne sound cannot. Our ancestors, who lived in a world far quieter than ours, who could hear a branch break from miles away, who could sense the vibration of hoofbeats through the ground, would they have noticed this? Would they have explored it? In the Ural Mountains of Russia, in a cave called Ignativskaya, researchers found grooves carved into the stone walls. At first, they appeared decorative, perhaps symbolic. But when they examined them more closely, they realized the grooves were spaced at specific intervals. And when they traced their fingers along them, the grooves produced sound, different pitches depending on speed and pressure. The walls were instruments. The cave was an interface. And carved beside these grooves were images, human figures with their hands pressed against the stone, as if listening, or as if transmitting. What were they trying to tell us? If you're still with me, if this resonates with something you've always sensed but never named, let the algorithm know. Not for my sake, but for yours, so you'll be reminded to return to these questions when the world grows too loud. Let's talk about the Neanderthals. For decades, we thought of them as brutish, less evolved, lacking the cognitive sophistication of Homo sapiens. Then we sequenced their genome. We found that they had the FOXP2 gene, the same genetic mutation that gives humans complex language ability. Their hyoid bones, the delicate horseshoe of bone in the throat that anchors the muscles controlling speech, were virtually identical to ours. They could speak. But did they? Their skeletal structure suggests something else. Neanderthal bones were denser than ours, particularly in the skull and chest. Denser bone vibrates differently, resonates at different frequencies. Their ear canals were shaped slightly differently too, optimized for lower frequencies than ours. What if they communicated primarily through vibration? What if their language was felt rather than heard? This would explain certain mysteries. Neanderthal sites show evidence of complex social organization, sophisticated tool use, even ritual behavior. Yet we find almost no evidence of the kind of symbolic communication, cave paintings, carved figurines, decorative objects, that proliferates at Homo sapiens sites. Perhaps they didn't need external symbols. Perhaps their communication was internal, resonant, carried through the very structure of their being. And perhaps we inherited it. There's a phenomenon in modern neuroscience called mirror touch synesthesia. People with this condition physically feel what they see others feeling. Watch someone touch their arm and you feel it on your own arm. See someone in pain and you experience phantom sensations in the corresponding part of your body. We classify this as a rare neurological condition. But what if it's actually a vestige, a remnant of an older system of communication, one that operated not through coded symbols but through direct somatic resonance? Think about how we actually communicate emotion. Yes, we use words, but watch two people in love or in grief or in rage. Their bodies synchronize. Their breathing aligns. Their heart rates converge. Place them in an MRI scanner and you'll see their neural patterns beginning to mirror each other. We call this empathy, but perhaps it's older than that. Perhaps it's the echo of a language that didn't require translation because it bypassed language entirely. In the Amazon rainforest, there are tribes that still practice something they call ayahuasca icaros, songs that shamans sing during healing ceremonies. But these aren't songs in the way we usually think of them. The melodies are simple, repetitive, built on drones and overtones. What matters isn't the words, which are often in archaic languages no one fully understands anymore, but the frequency. Anthropologists who've studied these ceremonies report that the songs seem to vibrate in their bones, in their chests, behind their eyes. The shamans say they're not inventing these songs. They're receiving them from the plants, from the forest itself. When researchers analyzed the frequencies of these icaros, they found something remarkable. The fundamental frequencies and their overtones match the resonant frequencies of human bone tissue with extraordinary precision. These aren't songs designed to be pretty. They're songs designed to be felt, to penetrate, to speak to the body directly. How old is this knowledge? How far back does it go? There's a theory in archaeology called behavioral modernity. The idea that around 50,000 years ago, something changed in human cognition. Suddenly, we see an explosion of symbolic behavior. Cave art, carved figurines, complex tools, elaborate burials. Before this period, the archaeological record is relatively sparse. After it, it's like someone turned on a light. The standard explanation is that this represents the emergence of modern human consciousness, the development of abstract thought and symbolic language. But what if it represents something else? What if it represents a transition from one form of communication to another? What if we didn't gain something 50,000 years ago, but lost something and had to compensate? Consider the evidence differently. Before this period, we have very few symbolic artifacts, but we have increasing brain size, complex social structures, successful hunting strategies that required sophisticated coordination. How were they coordinating without language? After this period, we have symbolic artifacts everywhere, because we needed them. We needed external symbols to replace an internal system that was fading. In Aboriginal Australian cultures, there's a concept called dadiri, deep, contemplative listening. It's described not as listening to words, but as listening to the land, to the ancestors, to a knowledge that comes from below and within. Elders say it's something you feel in your bones before you understand it in your mind. When anthropologists tried to find equivalent concepts in European languages, they struggled. The closest we have is intuition, but that's not quite right. Intuition suggests a vague feeling. Dadiri suggests a precise transmission of information through nonverbal, non-symbolic means. What if this isn't metaphor? What if it's description? Let's return to those bone flutes. When they're played in the chambers where they were found, not in modern concert halls with flat acoustics, but in caves with natural resonance, something else happens. The sound doesn't just travel through air. It travels through stone. The cave walls vibrate. And if you're standing in certain positions, if you place your hands against the stone, you feel it. The vibration enters your body through your palms, travels up your arms, spreads through your skeletal structure. And in that moment, you understand something without being told. The cave is alive. The stone is speaking. Your body is listening. Researchers have documented this. They call it archaeoacoustics, the study of sound in ancient spaces. And what they found is that virtually every major prehistoric ritual site has unusual acoustic properties. Stonehenge amplifies and transforms vocal frequencies. The oracle chamber at Delphi produces natural infrasound that induces trance states. The Great Pyramid of Giza has a resonant frequency that matches the human heartbeat. Coincidence? Or design? But here's where it gets truly unsettling. In 2019, a team of researchers at MIT developed a new technology called bone conduction speech recognition. The system uses sensors to detect the vibrations in skull bones when someone thinks words, not speaks them, but thinks them. The technology works because when we think linguistic thoughts, our brain sends faint signals to our vocal apparatus. These signals create microvibrations in the bones of the skull and jaw, too subtle to hear but detectable with sensitive instruments. In other words, we're already broadcasting our thoughts through our bones. We're just not consciously aware of it, and we don't have the biological sensitivity to detect it in others. But what if we once did? If our ancestors lived in silence, true silence, not the constant acoustic noise of modern life, would they have been sensitive enough to detect these bone vibrations? Would they have learned to amplify them, to modulate them, to communicate through them? There are accounts scattered across human cultures of people who claim to hear thoughts. We call them mystics, psychics, the delusional. We explain it away as imagination, as suggestibility, as fraud. But every so often, someone demonstrates abilities that can't quite be explained. The twins who seem to know each other's thoughts. The mother who wakes instantly when her child, miles away, is in distress. The martial arts master who appears to sense his opponent's intention before they move. We have no framework for these experiences, so we dismiss them. But what if they're the vestigial traces of an older capacity? What if some people, through genetics or training or sheer accident, retain a shadow of something we all once possessed? In the mountains of Tibet, there's a practice called lung gom, a form of meditation combined with rhythmic movement that supposedly allows practitioners to travel vast distances without tiring. Western observers who've witnessed it describe something uncanny. The practitioners seem to move in a trance state, their bodies vibrating subtly, their feet barely touching the ground. When asked to explain it, the monks don't talk about physical technique. They talk about tuning their bodies to the frequency of the earth, of synchronizing their internal vibration with the natural resonance of the world around them. Superstition or forgotten science? Consider that the earth itself has a resonant frequency, approximately 7.83 Hz, called the Schumann resonance. It's generated by lightning strikes in the atmosphere, creating a standing wave that circles the planet continuously. And the human brain, during deep meditation or certain sleep states, produces alpha and theta waves in roughly the same frequency range. We exist within a vibrating field. Our bodies are tuned to resonate with the planet we evolved on. Is it really so impossible that our ancestors, more attuned to natural rhythms than we are, learned to use this? Stay with us. The deeper we go, the stranger it becomes. And if you're feeling that subtle vibration of recognition, that sense that this is true in ways you can't quite articulate, you're already listening with more than your ears. Let's talk about silence. Not the absence of sound. True silence doesn't exist in nature. Even in the quietest places on Earth, there is always vibration. Wind moving through grass, water percolating through stone, the subtle creak and shift of the planet itself. But there's a kind of silence our ancestors knew that we've lost entirely. Acoustic silence, the absence of mechanical, artificial sound. Today, even in rural areas, there's the distant hum of highways, the overhead passage of aircraft, the electromagnetic buzz of power lines. Our auditory environment is never truly quiet, never truly still. And this matters more than we might think. Human hearing evolved in natural silence. Our auditory system is optimized to detect subtle variations, quiet sounds, the tiny acoustic signatures that might indicate danger or opportunity. A branch breaking, a breath drawn, a heartbeat. In our noisy world, we've lost that sensitivity. But our ancestors had it. And perhaps they had more than that. There's a tribe in Namibia called the Jew/Hoansi. They're one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer cultures, living much as humans lived for hundreds of thousands of years. Anthropologists studying them noticed something unusual. They could communicate over remarkable distances without raising their voices. At first, researchers thought they were using some sort of clicking language similar to other Khoisan languages. But when they studied it more carefully, they found something else. The hunters would stand very still, press their hands against their chests or throats, and produce sounds that were barely audible. Yet their companions, sometimes 100 meters away, would respond immediately. The researchers set up acoustic equipment to record these exchanges. What they found was that most of the communication was happening below the threshold of normal hearing, in the infrasound range below 20 Hz. These frequencies travel much farther than normal speech and penetrate obstacles that would block higher frequencies. But here's what's remarkable. The human ear can't hear infrasound directly. So how were they detecting it? Through bone conduction, the infrasound vibrations were traveling through the ground, up through their feet and legs, into their skeletal structure. They were feeling the communication rather than hearing it. And they were doing it consciously, deliberately, using it as a hunting strategy. When the anthropologists asked the hunters how they learned this, they said it wasn't taught. It was something you just knew, something that became obvious when you spent enough time in silence, paying attention to your body. What if this capacity is latent in all of us? What if we've simply forgotten how to access it? In the 1960s, a researcher named Vic Tandy was working late one night in a supposedly haunted laboratory. He began to feel uneasy, a sense of being watched, a chill, a subtle dread. Then he saw something move in his peripheral vision, a gray shape that vanished when he turned to look at it. The next day, he came back to investigate with acoustic equipment. He found that a recently installed ventilation fan was producing infrasound at 18.98 Hz, just below the threshold of hearing. This frequency, it turns out, matches the resonant frequency of the human eyeball. The infrasound was causing his eyes to vibrate, producing visual distortions that his brain interpreted as ghostly shapes. It was also affecting his chest cavity, creating feelings of anxiety and unease. Once he turned off the fan, the haunting stopped. But here's the deeper implication. If infrasound can affect us this profoundly, and we're producing it all the time, through our voices, our movements, even our heartbeats, what information might we be unconsciously transmitting and receiving? Ancient structures around the world seem designed to generate or amplify infrasound. The Great Pyramid produces infrasound at frequencies that induce altered states. The Oracle Chamber at Delphi sits on a geological fault that produces natural infrasound, which likely contributed to the prophetic visions reported there. Even Stonehenge, when accurate acoustic models are run, appears to have been optimized for infrasonic resonance. Were these places designed for communication, not with gods but with each other in ways we've forgotten? There's a story told among the Sami people of northern Scandinavia about the song lines or sound roads. According to tradition, the ancestors could travel vast distances through the winter darkness by following invisible paths that sang to them. For a long time, anthropologists assumed this was metaphorical, a poetic description of oral traditions about safe routes. But when researchers began mapping these traditional paths, they found something unexpected. The routes followed geological features, certain types of bedrock, underground water sources, mineral deposits, that all share one thing in common. They conduct vibration efficiently. The paths were literally sound roads, routes where vibration traveled most clearly through the earth. If you're still here, if you're feeling the pull of these ideas like a frequency you've always sensed but never isolated, consider sharing this. Not because I ask, but because someone you know might be listening for exactly this. Let's go back further. Let's go to the caves. In southern France, in a chamber called réseau, there's a section of wall covered in red ochre dots. Carbon dating puts them at approximately 27,000 years old. But what makes them remarkable isn't their age. It's their arrangement. The dots cluster in certain areas and avoid others. When researchers mapped the acoustic properties of the wall, they found that the dots were concentrated in the areas where sound resonated most powerfully. Strike a drum or sing in those spots, and the wall seems to answer, vibrating strongly enough to feel if you press your hand against it. The dots aren't decorations. They're markers, a map of resonance, a guide to the sweet spots where sound becomes tactile. Imagine the scene. A group gathered in flickering firelight, someone playing one of those ancient flutes. But they're not performing for an audience. They're mapping the cave, finding the places where the stone speaks back, marking them for future generations. And once you know where those places are, you can do something else. You can stand in one resonant spot while someone else stands in another, and the stone between you carries your vibrations. You can communicate through the cave itself using the earth as an instrument. This isn't speculation. Researchers have tested it. In caves with these ochre markers, two people standing at marked points can detect each other's vocalizations through bone conduction, even when normal hearing is impossible due to distance or intervening obstacles. The caves were communication systems, and the paintings, the elaborate art we've marveled at for centuries, might have been secondary. a way to mark and remember the acoustic properties of sacred spaces. What were they saying to each other, through stone and bone, in the darkness of those caves? In Japan, there's a tradition called kodadama, the belief that words have spiritual power, that spoken sounds can affect reality directly. But the tradition is more specific than that. It holds that certain frequencies, certain vibrational patterns, can influence physical matter and living tissue. This sounds like mysticism until you look at modern research in cymatics, the study of how vibration affects matter. Play certain frequencies near a plate covered in sand, and the sand arranges itself into intricate geometric patterns. Change the frequency, and the pattern changes instantly. Our bodies are mostly water, held in subtle suspension by cellular membranes. What patterns does sound create in us? What information might be encoded in vibration that we're no longer conscious of receiving? There's a therapy used in modern medicine called bone conduction therapy, where vibrations at specific frequencies are used to treat certain conditions, anxiety, chronic pain, even some neurological disorders. The mechanism isn't fully understood, but the results are undeniable. Certain frequencies make people feel better, calmer, more centered. Were these frequencies discovered recently or rediscovered? In the mythology of Aboriginal Australia, there's the concept of songlines, invisible pathways across the landscape that mark the journeys of ancestral beings. The stories say that the ancestors sang the world into existence, that every rock, every tree, every waterhole was created through song. We interpret this as metaphor, as creation myth. But the Aboriginal people are more literal about it. They say the songlines are real, that if you know the songs, you can navigate the desert without maps, you can find water in the most barren places, you can communicate across vast distances. When researchers began studying these songlines with modern equipment, they found something extraordinary. The paths corresponded to underground water sources, to mineral deposits, to geological features that all shared the property of conducting vibration efficiently. The songs weren't creating the landscape. The songs were describing the vibrational structure of the landscape, encoding it in a form that could be transmitted, remembered, and used for navigation and communication. The landscape was singing, and the ancestors learned to sing back. What if that's what all mythology really is, not primitive superstition, but sophisticated encoding of knowledge about the vibrational nature of reality? The Hindu concept of Om, the primordial vibration from which all existence emerged. The biblical account of creation beginning with the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Maori concept of karakia, chants that establish connection with the spiritual and physical world. Every culture has this notion that sound, vibration, frequency are fundamental to existence. We've filed this away as pre-scientific belief. But what if they were describing something real, something they could sense but we've lost the ability to perceive? Modern physics tells us that matter itself is vibration. At the quantum level, particles are better understood as waves, as oscillations in underlying fields. Everything that exists is, in a sense, a particular pattern of vibration. Fringe physicists and mystics love this, claiming vindication for ancient wisdom. But they usually miss the practical implications. If reality is fundamentally vibrational, and if our ancestors were more attuned to vibration than we are, then they might have perceived aspects of reality that we've become blind to. Not mystical, supernatural realities, just natural phenomena operating at frequencies we no longer consciously register. Let's talk about healing. In virtually every traditional culture, healing involves sound. Drums, chants, singing bowls, rattles. The specific instruments vary, but the principle is universal. Sound heals. We've tended to explain this psychologically. The rituals provide comfort, the community support reduces stress, the placebo effect does the rest. And certainly those factors matter. But there's also growing evidence that certain frequencies affect biological systems directly. Studies show that exposure to frequencies around 40 Hz can reduce Alzheimer's symptoms in mice, that 528 Hz promotes DNA repair, that various frequencies affect cellular metabolism, immune response, and neural activity. Traditional healers didn't have oscilloscopes or spectrum analyzers, but they had time, attention, and sensitivity we lack. They could observe cause and effect over generations. This sound helps fevers. That rhythm calms seizures. This frequency seems to knit broken bones faster. And perhaps they also understood something we're only now rediscovering. That bone is an ideal medium for delivering therapeutic vibration deep into the body's tissues. In the Amazon, shamans use a practice called saplata, blowing tobacco smoke or floral water over a patient's body while singing icaros. Anthropologists have documented that the shamans aren't just blowing randomly. They target specific areas: the top of the skull, the sternum, the solar plexus, the base of the spine. These correspond precisely to the major bone articulation points, places where vibration enters the skeletal system most efficiently. The blowing provides a physical sensation that helps the patient focus on that area, while the icaro provides the vibrational information. The smoke, the water, the ritual context, these matter psychologically. But the core technology is vibrational medicine delivered through bone conduction. How did they figure this out? Did someone teach them, or were they remembering? There's an account from the 1920s by an anthropologist named Ake Hultkrantz, who lived with various Native American tribes. He documented a healing practice where the healer would place their mouth against the patient's skull and produce a deep humming sound that lasted several minutes. Hultkrantz described feeling the vibration travel through his own skull when he was allowed to experience the practice. He said it felt like his brain was being massaged from the inside, that afterward he experienced unusual clarity and a sense of profound peace. The healer told him this was an ancient practice, older than memory, used to treat what we might call depression, anxiety, or spiritual distress. The vibration, he said, reminded the brain of its natural rhythm. When modern researchers discovered neural entrainment, the tendency of brain waves to synchronize with external rhythms, this practice suddenly made sense. The healer was generating frequencies that induced coherent neural activity, basically resetting the patient's brain patterns. But they'd been doing this for how long? Centuries? Millennia? Let's consider language itself differently. We think of language as arbitrary. The sounds we use to mean things have no inherent connection to their meanings. Tree could just as easily be blorg if we all agreed on it. This is called the arbitrariness of the sign, and it's a foundation of modern linguistics. But there's growing evidence that this isn't entirely true. Studies in sound symbolism show that certain sounds carry consistent associations across cultures. Harsh, sharp sounds tend to evoke spiky, aggressive concepts. Soft, rounded sounds suggest smooth, gentle things. And there's something deeper. When linguists analyze the basic vocabulary of unrelated languages, words for fundamental human experiences like mother, water, breath, they find curious commonalities in the phonetic structures. Words for mother, across dozens of language families, tend to use bilabial consonants, M, B, P, sounds made with both lips. These are the easiest sounds for infants to produce, but they're also sounds that produce particularly strong vibrations in the chest and skull. Words for water often include liquid consonants and open vowels. L, R, W, A, O, sounds that create flowing vibrational patterns. What if the earliest words weren't arbitrary at all? What if they were onomatopoetic in a deeper sense, not imitating the sounds things make, but matching the vibrational signatures of concepts, creating linguistic structures that resonated with the phenomena they described? If communication was originally vibrational, then the transition to spoken language might have retained a shadow of that earlier system. The words feel right not just because we're familiar with them, but because their vibrational properties align with what they signify. There's a practice in Tibetan Buddhism called Nada Yoga, the yoga of sound. Practitioners work with specific vocal tones and mantras designed to vibrate particular parts of the body. Each chakra, each energy center in the traditional system, has associated sounds that supposedly activate or balance it. Western practitioners often get excited about the spiritual implications. But look at it physiologically. The chakra points correspond to major nerve plexuses and endocrine glands, the parts of the body where neural and hormonal regulation occur. The associated sounds, when produced correctly, create vibrations that focus on these exact areas. The root chakra sound vibrates the pelvic floor. The heart chakra sound vibrates the chest cavity. The crown chakra sound vibrates the skull. This isn't mystical energy. It's targeted vibrational stimulation of physiologically important structures, developed through systematic experimentation over thousands of years. And it works. Studies on meditation and mantra practice show measurable effects. Reduced stress hormones, improved immune function, changes in brain structure and activity patterns. We attribute this to meditation generally, but specific sonic practices produce specific results. Our ancestors were running experiments. They were discovering what worked, and they encoded their findings in practices that survived because they were effective. When you think about this history, if you feel something resonating in you now, something that recognizes this as true, let that feeling guide you back. Subscribe not to me, but to your own curiosity about what we've forgotten. Let's address the question you're probably asking. If this vibrational communication system was so effective, why did we lose it? The answer might lie in what we gained. Spoken language, the kind we use now, has enormous advantages. It's versatile, rapid, can express abstract concepts with precision. It allows us to lie, to imagine, to construct elaborate hypothetical scenarios. It's the foundation of culture, technology, accumulated knowledge. But it required a trade-off. To process complex symbolic language, the human brain had to dedicate massive neural resources to linguistic centers, Broca's area, Wernicke's area, the arcuate fasciculus connecting them. These regions expanded dramatically in our recent evolutionary history. But brains have limited real estate. When some areas expand, others must contract or be repurposed. The parts of our brain that process subtle sensory information, that maintain awareness of the body's internal state, that detect minute variations in vibration and pressure, these became less dominant. We gained symbolic thought. We lost somatic sensitivity. There's a name for the awareness of your body's internal state. Interoception. It's the sense that tells you you're hungry, that your heart is racing, that you need to urinate. Most people's interoceptive awareness is fairly crude. We notice strong signals but miss subtle ones. But people with highly developed interoceptive awareness report experiences that sound almost supernatural. They can sense their heartbeat without feeling their pulse. They can detect minute changes in body temperature that indicate emotional shifts. Some claim to feel the electrical activity of their nervous system. Athletes, dancers, martial artists often develop enhanced interoception through training. And they describe communication that happens below the level of conscious thought. The basketball player who knows where their teammate will be without looking, the dancers who move in perfect synchrony without cueing. What if everyone once had this? What if our baseline interoception was an order of magnitude more sensitive? Then you wouldn't need words to communicate basic information. The other person's internal state would be obvious to you through subtle vibrations, micro-expressions, patterns too complex and rapid for conscious processing but perfectly legible to the body. Language would be supplementary, used for abstract planning or rare situations where somatic communication wasn't clear. Most of the time, you'd simply know. The archaeological evidence might support this timeline. For hundreds of thousands of years, human material culture was relatively static. The same stone tools persisted for tens of thousands of years. Then, around 70,000 years ago, we see the beginning of behavioral modernity. Innovation accelerates, symbolic objects appear, culture becomes diverse and rapidly changing. The standard interpretation is that this represents the emergence of modern cognition. But what if it represents the emergence of modern language, complex, symbolic, verbal language that allowed rapid cultural transmission at the cost of older, somatic ways of knowing? We call it progress, and in many ways it was. But every gain involves loss. The fish that crawled onto land gained legs and lungs but lost gills and the ability to breathe underwater. We gained speech. What did we lose? In the Finnish epic, the Kalevala, there's a description of the ancient bard Vainamoinen, whose songs could reshape reality, cause trees to bend, stones to crack, waters to rise. The power wasn't in the words themselves, but in the way he sang them. Descriptions suggest deep, resonant tones that could be felt in the earth. In the Irish tradition, the Druids were said to possess a power called glam dyson, a satirical poetry so potent it could cause physical harm, even death. The poet would speak or sing the satire while standing on one leg, with one eye closed, pointing at their target. We read these as magical thinking, fantasy. But consider the specifics. Standing on one leg changes your body's resonance. Martial artists and dancers know this. Closing one eye alters your brain state, shifting the balance between hemispheres. The pointing provides focus and directionality. These aren't random details added for mystical flavor. They're technical specifications, instructions for optimizing the vibrational impact of vocalization. What if these legends preserve memories of techniques that actually worked, not as magic, but as sophisticated applications of vibrational influence? In 2015, researchers at the University of Bristol developed a technology called acoustic levitation, using focused sound waves to lift and manipulate small objects. The frequencies involved are ultrasonic, beyond human hearing, but the principle is simple. Vibration carries force, and if you focus that force precisely, it can overcome gravity. Within months, speculation erupted. Could this be how the ancients moved massive stones? Was this the secret of the pyramids, of Stonehenge, of the massive blocks at Pumapunku? The idea seems absurd. Moving multi-ton blocks with sound? Impossible. Except that sound can move matter. We've proven it. The question is scale. And here's what's interesting. Many ancient accounts of megalithic construction mention sound. Egyptian legends speak of priests who could make stones light with particular chants. Tibetan texts describe monks who levitated stones using drums and horns. Peruvian myths tell of the Inca using a sound that could soften stone. We've dismissed these as fabrications, explanations invented by people who couldn't imagine how such feats were accomplished. But what if they were descriptions, not explanations? What if someone actually saw something and this is how they described it? The skeptic's response is, if acoustic levitation of large stones were possible, we'd be able to do it now with our advanced technology. But would we? We're only beginning to explore these phenomena. Our acoustic technology is optimized for things like speakers and sonar, not for manipulating solid matter. And we've lost centuries, millennia of empirical knowledge about how sound affects stone, earth, and bone. If a culture spent thousands of years experimenting with acoustic phenomena in natural silence, without the theoretical constraints of modern physics telling them what was impossible, what might they have discovered through pure trial and observation? In the 1990s, a Japanese researcher named Masaru Emoto published controversial work on water crystals. He claimed that water exposed to positive words formed beautiful crystals when frozen, while water exposed to negative words formed chaotic structures. The scientific community largely rejected his work. The experiments weren't properly controlled, the results weren't independently replicated, confirmation bias seemed obvious. But even skeptical researchers acknowledged something curious. Water does respond to vibration. Its molecular structure is affected by sound. And given that our bodies are mostly water, and that bone vibrates efficiently, what information might be carried in the vibrational patterns we produce? What patterns might be impressed upon the fluid systems of the body through bone conduction? This is where science ends and speculation begins, but it's speculation our ancestors might have treated as observation. If you've stayed this far, you're no longer just listening, you're resonating. And maybe that's the point. Maybe this isn't about information at all, but about recognition. Let's talk about the mother of all unsettling possibilities. What if the system isn't entirely lost? What if it's dormant? There are people, rare but documented, who demonstrate unusual abilities. The blind person who navigates by echolocation, clicking their tongue and interpreting the subtle returning echoes. The pianist who can hear a piece once and play it perfectly, their fingers moving before their conscious mind processes the notes. The twins who seem to share sensation and thought. We classify these as exceptional abilities, genetic quirks, intensive training. But what if they're not exceptions but reversions? What if these people have, by accident or effort, partially reactivated capacities that we all possess in latent form? The neuroscience is suggestive. Human brains show remarkable plasticity. Blind people's visual cortices get repurposed for processing auditory and tactile information. London taxi drivers grow enlarged hippocampi from memorizing the city's streets. Meditators show thickening in brain areas associated with interoception and body awareness. The hardware is still there. We've just rewired it, optimized it for symbolic processing and abstract thought rather than somatic sensitivity. But it can be rewired again, or perhaps re-remembered. There's a practice in some martial arts traditions called listening energy, the ability to sense your opponent's intention through physical contact. When two practitioners are connected, even lightly, a skilled practitioner can feel the subtle shifts in tension and vibration that precede conscious movement. To outsiders, it looks like mind reading or supernatural sensitivity. But practitioners insist it's purely physical, a matter of training your body to detect information that's actually there, just below the threshold of normal awareness. And they say anyone can learn it. It just requires time, silence, and attention to sensations we usually ignore. What if that's the key? What if the lost art of bone vibration communication isn't lost at all, just buried under layers of noise, technological noise, linguistic noise, the constant chatter of symbolic thought that drowns out subtler signals? In modern life, we're almost never in silence. Even when it's quiet, we're thinking, narrating our experience to ourselves in words, maintaining the internal monologue that constitutes much of conscious experience. But that monologue is relatively recent in evolutionary terms. It's a product of internalized language, the voice of culture speaking in your head. What would happen if you turned it off? Not occasionally, but systematically, the way our ancestors must have experienced consciousness before complex language. Meditation traditions suggest you discover other ways of knowing, other channels of information. They describe this in spiritual terms, connection with the universe, transcendence of the ego. But maybe it's simpler and stranger than that. Maybe you just start noticing what your body already knows, what it's sensing constantly but not translating into conscious thought. The vibrations that surround you, the subtle resonances between your body and other bodies, the information encoded in frequencies below and above the range of conscious hearing, but well within the range of bone conduction. You might start to understand why ancient people spent so much time in caves, in stone chambers, in places where resonance was strongest. Not for ritual or magic, but for communication, for healing, for forms of social bonding we can barely imagine now. You might realize that the sense of presence people report in certain places, sacred sites, ancient structures, even some natural formations, isn't supernatural. It's residual vibration, patterns imprinted in stone that resonate with human bone, creating feelings and even images without passing through conscious sensory processing. You might understand what the Aboriginal Australians mean when they say the land is alive, what the Celtic peoples meant by thin places where the veil between worlds grows permeable. Not metaphysics, acoustics, resonance. Information carried in frequencies we've taught ourselves not to notice. And if you went deep enough into this silence, this sensitivity, this listening with the body instead of the ears, what would you hear? Who would you hear? In the archives of anthropological research, there's a strange little footnote. Multiple researchers, working with different indigenous groups separated by continents and centuries, have reported the same unsettling experience. They'll be in the field, living with a community when someone will react to something, alarm, joy, sadness, and the anthropologist will ask what happened. The person will say they received word from a relative in a distant village. But no messenger came. No signal fire, no drum message, nothing the researcher observed. Later, days or weeks later, it's confirmed. The relative did die or did give birth or did return from a long journey at the time the person claimed to know about it. The anthropologists would note this, feel uncomfortable, and usually file it as coincidence or as something they must have missed. Because the alternative, that information traveled without observable mechanism, violated their framework for understanding reality. But what if they didn't miss anything? What if information traveled through channels they weren't equipped to detect? Infrasound can travel hundreds of miles through the earth. Human bone can detect it. And if two people were both highly sensitive, both trained in listening with their bodies rather than their ears, both tuned to specific frequencies, is it really impossible that they could communicate across distances that should make such communication impossible? Or are we simply so buried in symbolic language, in spoken words and written texts, that we've become deaf to older, deeper forms of transmission? In quantum physics, there's a phenomenon called entanglement. Two particles that were once connected remain correlated even when separated by vast distances. Change the state of one, and the other changes instantaneously, faster than light could travel between them. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance and resisted it. But it's real. It's been proven repeatedly. Now, the human body isn't a quantum system in any simple sense. We're too warm, too big, too complex for quantum effects to dominate our biology. Or are we? Recent research suggests that quantum effects might be crucial for photosynthesis, for birds' magnetic navigation, possibly even for consciousness itself. The boundaries between quantum and classical physics are blurrier than we thought, especially in biological systems. What if entanglement isn't the right concept? But there's something analogous. Some form of correlation, of resonant coupling between biological systems that doesn't require particle exchange or wave transmission through normal channels. This is pure speculation, beyond the edge of current science. But it's the kind of speculation our ancestors might have explored not through theory but through practice, through centuries of experimenting with what the body could do in silence. And perhaps they found that consciousness isn't as isolated as we believe. That in the absence of linguistic thought, in states of deep bodily awareness, information flows through channels science hasn't mapped because we don't know how to look for them. Perhaps that's what all the myths about telepathy, about shared dreams, about knowing things you shouldn't be able to know, perhaps those are memories of what human consciousness could do before language boxed it in, made it individual, separate, locked inside a skull. The price we paid for civilization might have been loneliness. Let's come back to those bone flutes. Let's end where we began, but seeing it differently now. 40,000 years ago, someone took the femur of a cave bear, an animal that stood 12 feet tall, that ruled the forests and mountains, that was power incarnate. They carved it carefully, precisely, creating holes at specific intervals that shouldn't have been possible without understanding harmonics, without knowing mathematics we credit to cultures 30,000 years in the future. Why? The standard answer is music. Humans make music. It's what we do. It's part of what makes us human. But what if it wasn't about making beautiful sounds? What if it was about communication in an environment where speech couldn't carry far enough, where survival required coordination across distances? What if those flutes were technology, not art? Tools for extending the range and precision of bone vibration communication, for creating frequencies that would penetrate deeper, resonate more powerfully, carry information further than the human voice alone could manage? We've found these flutes in caves all over Europe, in contexts that suggest ceremonial or ritual use. But ceremony and utility aren't opposites. The most important technologies are the ones that get ritualized, preserved, protected through tradition. What if the music was language? What if the caves weren't concert halls but communication hubs, and the paintings were something like writing, encoding not words but vibrational patterns, creating a library of frequencies that could be learned, practiced, transmitted across generations? Then the decline of this system, the transition to spoken language, would have felt like amnesia, like waking up one day and finding that half your vocabulary was gone, that you could no longer say things that once came naturally. The myths of the fall, of paradise lost, of a golden age when humans and gods walked together, maybe they're memories of this transition. Not literal history, but the echo of a real loss, a genuine diminishment of capacity that came with the explosion of symbolic culture. We gained everything we call civilization, but we lost the ability to be truly, somatically present with each other. We lost the capacity to communicate below the level of symbol and interpretation, where meaning was immediate, embodied, undeniable. We lost the ability to resonate. And perhaps that's why these ideas feel haunting. Why something in you responds to this story even though it challenges everything you were taught about human history. Because your body remembers what your mind has forgotten. In your bones, there's a library. In your skeleton, there's an instrument. And in silence, true silence, the kind that barely exists anymore, you might hear it start to play. Not with your ears. Deeper than that. If you close your eyes right now, if you place your hand over your heart, if you hum quietly and feel the vibration spread through your chest, up your throat, into your skull, you're doing what they did. You're activating the ancient mechanism. It doesn't do much now. We've lost the sensitivity to interpret what it transmits. We've lost the skill to modulate it consciously for communication. But it's there. Still there. Dormant but not dead. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. We think of lost civilizations, lost technologies, lost knowledge as something external. Books burned, buildings collapsed, artifacts buried under sand and time. But what if the most profound loss wasn't external? What if it was internal, encoded in the very structure of our bodies and brains, waiting to be remembered? The ancient Greeks had a concept, anamnesis, often translated as remembrance or recollection, but with a specific meaning in Platonic philosophy, the idea that learning is actually the soul remembering what it knew before birth. We've long since abandoned this as mysticism. But what if there's a biological version of anamnesis? What if the body carries memories that the mind doesn't, capacities that feel latent because they are latent, waiting for the right conditions to reactivate? Evolution doesn't waste resources. Capacities that are unused for a few thousand years don't disappear from the genome. They just become recessive, silent, switched off by epigenetic modifications that can, in theory, be switched back on. What if someone, through training, through chance, through deliberate experimentation, reactivated these capacities? What would they be able to do? Would they be able to communicate without speaking, transmitting meaning through vibration and resonance? Would they be able to sense others' internal states, not through cold reading or body language analysis, but through direct somatic awareness? Would they be able to affect physical matter, their own bodies and perhaps others, through precisely controlled vocalization and resonance? This sounds like superpowers, like fantasy. But remove the supernatural framing, and it's just biology, complex, poorly understood biology, but biology nonetheless. And if one person could do it, others could learn. If others could learn, communities could form. If communities formed around these practices, culture could shift. We could, in theory, remember, not regress. We're not giving up language, technology, everything we've built, but expand. Add to our toolkit the capacities we traded away when we committed fully to symbolic culture. What would that look like? What would humanity become? There's a passage in the Upanishads, the ancient Hindu texts, that describes the ultimate reality as Nada Brahma. Sound is God. Vibration is the fundamental nature of existence. For thousands of years, this was read as religious metaphor. Then quantum mechanics discovered that matter is waves, that reality at its deepest level is vibrational. And suddenly the metaphor seemed less metaphorical. What if the ancients weren't speculating about the nature of reality? What if they were describing their experience of it, the way it felt when consciousness operated through somatic awareness rather than symbolic thought? When you experience the world as vibration, when your body is tuned to detect and interpret frequencies, reality literally becomes music. Not poetic music, actual patterns of resonance and interference, harmony and dissonance, that carry information and meaning. That's the world our ancestors might have lived in. That's the world we've translated into symbols and lost the ability to directly perceive. But it's still there. Reality hasn't changed. Only our way of experiencing it has. And any way that can change again. If the story resonates, if it vibrates something in you, don't let it end here. There are others listening, others who feel this pull toward something older and deeper than words. Let them find this too. So here we are, at the end of this journey through time and bone and silence. We started with a flute carved 40,000 years ago, impossibly precise, tuned to frequencies that human bodies respond to at the deepest level. We explored the evidence. Caves that amplify sound in specific spots marked by ancient paint. Cultures around the world maintaining practices that use vibration for healing, navigation, communication. Modern technology rediscovering principles that seem encoded in myths and monuments thousands of years old. We asked uncomfortable questions. What if humanity communicated differently once? What if we lost a sensory capacity when we gained complex language? What if the transition to symbolic culture came at a cost we don't acknowledge because we can't remember what we lost? And we arrived at the most unsettling possibility of all. What if it's not truly lost? What if it's dormant, encoded in our bodies, accessible through silence and sensitivity and a willingness to trust somatic knowing over linguistic thought? This isn't provable. Not with the standards of modern archaeology or neuroscience. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. The alternative explanations, that ancient acoustic technologies were coincidental, that myths about vibrational power are pure fantasy, that reported instances of inexplicable communication are misremembered or fabricated, these remain possible. But they require us to believe in an awful lot of coincidence. An awful lot of independent invention of similar practices in cultures that never contacted each other. An awful lot of detailed, specific claims that just happen to align with phenomena we're only now beginning to understand scientifically. The principle of parsimony, Occam's razor, says we should prefer the simplest explanation that accounts for the evidence. What's simpler? That hundreds of cultures across thousands of years independently developed elaborate mythologies and practices around sound and vibration for purely symbolic reasons? Or that they were describing, preserving, and teaching real techniques that addressed aspects of human capacity we've since forgotten? You decide. That's always been the point of this. Not to convince you of a specific truth, but to invite you into a space of uncertainty and wonder, where the past is more mysterious and the present more full of possibility than the standard stories allow. Because here's what we know for certain. Human history is deeper and stranger than any curriculum teaches. Our ancestors were not primitive. They were differently sophisticated, optimized for a world we no longer inhabit, possessing skills we no longer value or practice. And we are not the pinnacle of human potential. We're one configuration among many possible configurations, one set of trade-offs in the eternal negotiation between brain structure, culture, and environment. We chose, or perhaps it chose us, symbolic language, abstract thought, technological civilization. These choices brought wonders. Science, literature, the ability to coordinate millions of people toward common goals. But evolution doesn't give without taking. Brains reorganize, capacities shift. The sensitivity required to navigate by somatic awareness of vibration isn't compatible with the constant internal monologue required to maintain a symbolic self. We became individuals, isolated in our skulls, connected to others only through the intermediary of symbols. Words, gestures, expressions that must be decoded, interpreted, endlessly translated. Perhaps our ancestors were individuals too, in their own way. But perhaps they were also permeable, resonant, capable of a kind of intimacy we can barely imagine now. Perhaps they stood in caves and felt the stones singing, and knew that the person standing in another chamber was singing back, and understood without words what was being transmitted through the earth itself. Perhaps they gathered in circles and synchronized their breathing, their heartbeats, their neural rhythms until they were less like separate entities and more like instruments in an orchestra, each contributing to a harmony that none could produce alone. Perhaps they experienced consciousness not as a private theater but as a shared field, a space of collective awareness where information flowed through channels we've sealed off, made inaccessible through the very structure of modern thought. This sounds like mysticism, but it's grounded in biology. We know that human physiology responds to vibration. We know that groups can entrain their rhythms. We know that skilled practitioners of body-based practices demonstrate sensitivities that seem impossible until you see them demonstrated repeatedly. The question isn't whether any of this is possible in principle. The question is scale and skill, how far these capacities extend, how much they can accomplish, how they compare to the symbolic technologies we've developed to replace them. And that's a historical question, an empirical question, one we might actually answer if we approached it with open minds and rigorous methods. Imagine a research program that took seriously the possibility that ancient technologies existed which operated on principles we haven't fully mapped. That studied traditional practices not as quaint folk customs but as potential repositories of functional knowledge. That trained people in body awareness and somatic sensitivity to see what capacities might emerge, what could be learned from the inside that can't be observed from the outside. This would be controversial. It would challenge disciplinary boundaries, academic conventions, the materialist assumptions that dominate modern science. But it would also be fascinating. And if even a fraction of what the myths and monuments suggest turned out to be recoverable, we might discover that we're not as advanced as we think. That we're recovering ground our ancestors covered long ago, rediscovering principles they encoded in stone and song and the training of their children's bodies. That's not a comforting thought if you invest in the narrative of linear progress, of primitive ancestors and enlightened moderns. But it's thrilling if you're open to the possibility that humanity has been brilliant in more ways than one, that we've traveled different paths before and might travel them again, that the future doesn't have to look like an extrapolation of the present. What if the future looks like remembering? What if the next revolution in human consciousness isn't forward but downward? Not into new technologies but into old capacities, not building but excavating. What if the most advanced thing we could do is learn to be still, to be silent, to feel the vibrations that are always there, carrying information we've taught ourselves to ignore? There's a practice in some contemplative traditions where you sit in silence and simply observe the sensations of your body without trying to change them. Just notice. Just feel. First, it's boring, frustrating. Your mind wanders. You think about your shopping list, your relationships, your plans for tomorrow. But if you persist, if you do this regularly, patiently, without expectation, something shifts. You start noticing subtler sensations. The pulse of blood in your fingertips. The subtle expansion and contraction of your skull with each heartbeat. The waves of tension and release that move through your muscles continuously. And if you go deeper still, some people report experiencing things that sound impossible. Feeling the electrical activity of their nervous system. Sensing the precise moment when neurotransmitters cross synaptic gaps. Perceiving their body not as a solid object but as a field of vibration, energy in constant motion. These reports are dismissed as subjective, unprovable, likely misinterpreted or imagined. But what if they're not? What if the body knows things about itself that consciousness usually ignores? And what if deliberate practice can bring some of that knowledge into awareness? Then the contemplative traditions aren't about spirituality at all or not primarily. They're about recovering sensitivity, about undoing the habituation that lets us function in complex symbolic culture but cuts us off from somatic knowing. They're about remembering how to listen with your bones. And if you could do that, if anyone could do that, through training and practice and the willingness to trust bodily knowledge over linguistic thought, what would become possible? Maybe not levitating stones or telepathy or the grander claims of ancient power. Maybe those are exaggerations, misunderstandings, wishful thinking. But maybe something. Maybe communication that's more immediate, less subject to misinterpretation. Maybe healing that works with the body's own resonances rather than against them. Maybe a sense of connection to place and to other people that doesn't depend on constant verbal negotiation. Maybe a way of being human that's less isolated, less anxious, less dependent on the endless translation between internal experience and external symbol. Maybe just a different way. Not better in all respects, but better in some. A complement to linguistic consciousness rather than a replacement. And if we could integrate both, if we could maintain our capacity for abstract thought and symbolic culture while recovering somatic sensitivity, what would we become? Not superhuman, not magical, just more fully human, accessing more of our potential, remembering more of what we've always been capable of. That's the real possibility here. Not that our ancestors were wizards or that ancient aliens taught them secrets, but that humans, working within the constraints and possibilities of different times and places, discovered things we've forgotten. And that we could, if we chose to, remember. Not through archaeology alone, though archaeology gives us clues. Not through anthropology alone, though anthropology preserves the echoes. But through practice. Through the patient exploration of what our own bodies can do when we strip away the noise and the haste and the constant linguistic processing that modern life demands. Through silence, through stillness, through paying attention to vibrations we've learned to ignore. This is where the story ends, but perhaps it's also where something begins. You've listened this far. You've followed the thread through caves and bones and frequencies, through myths and monuments and the strange gaps in what we think we know about human history. You've felt something or you wouldn't still be here. Not just intellectual curiosity, though that too, but something deeper, a resonance. The ideas in this story aren't new, not really. Pieces of them exist in academic literature, in anthropological reports, in the preserved wisdom of indigenous cultures. But they're fragmented, siloed, kept separate by disciplinary boundaries and the assumption that ancient peoples couldn't have known what modern science has only recently discovered. When you bring them together, when you let them inform each other, a picture emerges. Not a proven theory, but a possibility. A way of understanding the past that makes sense of puzzles we've been dismissing or explaining away. And more than that, it suggests something about the future. We live in a time of extraordinary technological power and extraordinary disconnection. We can communicate instantly with anyone on Earth, yet rates of loneliness and isolation are higher than ever recorded. We have more information available than any previous generation could imagine, yet wisdom seems scarce. We're more connected and more alone simultaneously. Maybe this is the cost of living entirely through symbolic mediation. Maybe when all communication is linguistic, written, spoken, transmitted through screens and speakers, we lose something essential. Not information, but presence. Not meaning, but resonance. And maybe the answer isn't to reject technology, to return to some imagined primitive purity. That's neither possible nor desirable. The knowledge and capabilities we've developed are real achievements, genuine expansions of human possibility. But maybe we could integrate. Maybe we could be people who think symbolically and feel somatically, who analyze abstractly and perceive intuitively, who use language without being imprisoned by it. That would require learning or relearning to trust the body's knowing, to honor silence, to recognize that not everything that matters can be spoken or written or captured in symbols. It would require practices that our culture doesn't value. Sitting still, moving slowly, paying attention to subtle sensations, spending time in places where natural resonance is strong and artificial noise is absent. It would require humility about what we know and curiosity about what we've forgotten. But if you're listening to this, probably in the dark, probably relaxed or drifting towards sleep, you're already practicing something like this. You're letting words wash over you without demanding that each one be analyzed and understood. You're in a liminal state between waking thought and sleep, where the boundaries of the symbolic self loosen, where other ways of knowing can emerge. This is why content like this works for sleep. Not despite its complexity, but because of it. The mind has something to engage with, but it's not demanding engagement. The narrative flow carries you, but it doesn't insist that you follow every detail. And underneath the words, there's a rhythm, a cadence, a pattern of repetition and variation that's almost musical. Not by accident, by design. Because sound and meaning are inseparable, and the way something is said changes what it says. Our ancestors knew this. Their myths and songs weren't just content to be extracted and analyzed. They were performances, experiences, patterns of vibration that carried meaning in their form as much as their words. We've tried to reduce everything to pure content, pure information. But information without resonance is hollow. Facts without feeling don't move us, don't change us, don't stick. The stories that matter are the ones that vibrate, that resonate with something in you that predates language, that connects to the long history of human consciousness stretching back before words existed. This story, whatever its factual accuracy, is trying to be that kind of story. To work on you not just intellectually but somatically. To make you feel something in your body, not just think something in your mind. If it worked, if you feel something now, a curiosity or a recognition or a vague dissatisfaction with the standard stories about human history, then it succeeded. Not in proving anything. Proof requires evidence this story can't provide. But in opening a space, a possibility, a question that won't quite go away. What if? What if the ancients knew things we don't? What if human potential is broader than we've imagined? What if you, personally, have capacities you've never explored because nobody taught you they existed? What if the future isn't about becoming more than human, but about becoming more fully human? These are the questions worth living with. Not answering definitively, but holding, exploring, testing in the laboratory of your own experience. Maybe nothing comes of it. Maybe you listen to this, find it interesting, and move on with your life unchanged. That's fine. Not everything has to be transformative. But maybe something does come of it. Maybe you find yourself more aware of your body, more sensitive to vibration and resonance. Maybe you experiment with silence, with humming, with paying attention to sensations you usually ignore. Maybe you notice things you hadn't noticed before. And maybe very slowly something shifts. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but incrementally you become slightly more present, slightly more connected, slightly less trapped in linguistic thought and symbolic mediation. That would be enough. That would be more than enough. Because if enough people did this, if enough of us recovered even a fraction of our somatic capacity, culture would shift. Not through revolution or proclamation, but through quiet, gradual changes in how we relate to ourselves, each other, and the world. We might become a little less lonely, a little more embodied, a little more capable of communication that doesn't depend on perfect articulation and interpretation. We might, in some small but real sense, remember, and that remembering wouldn't be a return to the past, but a spiral forward, carrying the achievements of symbolic culture while recovering capacities that symbolic culture overshadowed. That's the promise hidden in these ancient flutes, these painted caves, these myths of silent speech and vibrational power. Not that we should worship the past or imagine it as a golden age, but that we should recognize it as a source of knowledge, a library of experiments in how to be human, some of which produced results we've yet to match. And if we approach that library with curiosity rather than condescension, with the assumption that our ancestors were solving real problems with real techniques rather than inventing supernatural fantasies, we might find things worth recovering. We might find that the answer to some of our modern ailments was developed thousands of years ago and encoded in practices we've dismissed as primitive superstition. We might find that progress isn't linear, that we've been down paths before that we could travel again, better equipped this time with knowledge from multiple traditions and eras. We might find that human nature is more plastic, more full of possibility, more capable of transformation than our current assumptions allow. Or we might not. Maybe this is all speculation, pattern seeking in noise, the human tendency to find meaning in chaos. But isn't the exploration worthwhile anyway? Isn't the question interesting enough to justify asking it, even if the answer turns out to be disappointing? You're here after all. You've listened for how long now? An hour? More? You could have turned this off at any time, gone to something simpler, more immediately entertaining, more certain in its conclusions. But you stayed, because something in this story spoke to you, resonated with you, made you feel less alone in your intuition that the official narratives are incomplete, that there's more to human history and human potential than the textbooks acknowledge. And you're not alone. Thousands of people listen to content like this, seeking the same thing. Stories that take them seriously, that treat them as capable of understanding complexity, that don't condescend or simplify. We're all out here, in the dark, listening to voices that speak to something older than the modern world, trying to remember what we've forgotten, trying to imagine what we might become. This is a community, though we rarely meet, a resonance, though we're not physically connected, a shared frequency, tuned to curiosity and wonder and the suspicion that the universe is stranger and more magnificent than consensus reality admits. And maybe that's the modern version of bone vibration communication. Not literal vibrations through skeleton, but ideas and stories that resonate across distances, that synchronize consciousness not through physical mechanisms but through shared attention and recognition. Maybe we're already doing it, already practicing a kind of communication that's more than linguistic, that works through pattern and rhythm and the deep structures that underlie language rather than through the specific meanings of words. Maybe every community, every culture, every instance of people feeling connected without quite knowing why. Maybe those are echoes of the older system, adapted to modern constraints. And maybe by recognizing this, by making it conscious, we can strengthen it. We can become more deliberate in creating resonance, in seeking out frequencies that synchronize rather than divide, in building cultures of somatic awareness rather than pure symbolic processing. This is speculation piled on speculation now. But speculation is where all discovery begins. The willingness to ask, what if? And follow where it leads, even when it leads to places that don't fit comfortably in existing frameworks. Our ancestors did this. They experimented with sound and stone and the capacities of their own bodies. They discovered things, encoded them in practices and monuments and myths, passed them down through generations. We can do it too. We can experiment. We can pay attention. We can trust that our bodies know things our minds don't, that our direct experience is valid even when it contradicts official explanations. We can remember, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to change how we understand the past. Enough to expand what we believe possible in the present. Enough to imagine futures that aren't just extrapolations of current trends but genuine alternatives. Different ways of organizing consciousness and culture and connection. That's the gift of this kind of history. It liberates us from the assumption that this is the only way, the inevitable way, the culmination of human development. It shows us that humans have been brilliant in ways we're not, that we've lost things as well as gained them, that the path forward might sometimes require looking back. And it invites us to participate, not just as passive consumers of information but as active experimenters in the laboratory of our own experience. Try it, test it, sit in silence, pay attention to vibration, see what you notice that you've been ignoring. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Either way, you'll know something you didn't know before, about the limits of current knowledge, or about your own capacities, or about the subtle ways that reality communicates when we're quiet enough to listen. And that knowledge, whatever it is, will be yours. Embodied, direct, impossible to transmit fully through words but perfectly real nonetheless. Which is perhaps the deepest irony of this entire narrative. I've used thousands of words to point toward something that words can't capture. I've built an elaborate linguistic structure to suggest that you might not need linguistic structures at all. But that's the only way to do it. You have to use the tools, you have to reach beyond them. You have to speak to point toward silence. You have to analyze to suggest that analysis has limits. And if you've heard what I'm not quite saying, if you've felt what I'm not quite describing, then these words succeeded despite themselves. Now we're truly at the end. You've traveled with me through prehistory and speculation, through evidence and imagination, through the borderlands where archaeology meets mythology and both meet the mysteries of human consciousness. You've considered possibilities that seem impossible until you really think about them. You've held questions that don't have answers yet, that might not have answers ever, that are valuable precisely because they can't be resolved cleanly. You've felt something. I know you have, or you wouldn't still be listening. And what you do with that feeling is up to you. You can file this away as interesting but ultimately unverifiable, a compelling story but nothing more. You can return to your regular life, unchanged, unbothered by these speculations about ancient technologies and forgotten capacities. That's legitimate. Not everything has to change us. Not every idea has to be pursued. Or you can let it linger. You can notice, in the coming days and weeks, whether you pay more attention to silence, to vibration, to the sensations in your body that usually go unnoticed. You can experiment gently with paying attention differently. You can seek out quiet places. Not just acoustically quiet, but quiet from the hum of electronics, from the buzz of power lines, from the constant low-level noise of modern infrastructure. Places where your nervous system can settle, where sensitivity can emerge. You can practice listening, not to words, but to resonance. Not with your ears, but with your body. You can explore whether there's anything to this, whether you can feel what I've been describing, whether somatic awareness can become a functional capacity rather than just an interesting concept. And if you do this, you might find something. Or you might find nothing. The only way to know is to try. But even trying changes something. Even the willingness to experiment with perception, to question the adequacy of linguistic consciousness, to honor the body's knowing that itself is a shift. It opens a door that can't quite be closed again. The possibility that reality is richer, stranger, more full of potential than the standard stories admit. And once that door is open, you start noticing things. Coincidences that feel meaningful. Patterns that seem too consistent to be accidental. Moments of connection or knowing that don't fit the mechanistic explanations you were taught. You might dismiss these too. Pattern seeking in noise, wishful thinking, confirmation bias. All the standard explanations remain available. But you might also pause. You might wonder. You might stay with the uncertainty long enough to see what else emerges. That's all this story asks. Not belief but curiosity. Not conviction but exploration. Not certainty but the willingness to not be certain, to remain open to possibilities that don't fit comfortably in existing frameworks. Our ancestors, whoever they were, whatever they knew, would have approached the world this way. They didn't have frameworks. They had experience, observation, trial, and error over generations. They noticed what worked and didn't worry too much about why it worked. They developed practices that produced results and encoded those practices in traditions that could survive the loss of explicit understanding. And some of those traditions survived. Some are still practiced. Some are waiting to be rediscovered by people willing to take them seriously, to test them, to see what happens when ancient methods meet modern awareness. This is happening already in small pockets around the world. Researchers studying traditional healing practices and finding measurable physiological effects. Anthropologists documenting acoustic properties of ancient sites and discovering they're not accidental. Neuroscientists exploring states of consciousness that traditional cultures have been mapping for millennia. The academy is slow, cautious, constrained by paradigms and publication requirements. But it's moving. The evidence is accumulating. The possibilities are expanding. In a decade, in a generation, some of what I've presented as speculation might be established fact. Or it might be debunked, explained away, filed under interesting but wrong. Either way, we'll know more. And knowing more is always valuable, even when what we learn is that our previous ideas were mistaken. But you don't have to wait for the academy. You can explore now in your own life, in your own body. You can be your own laboratory, your own experiment. Not scientifically rigorous, perhaps. Not publishable in peer-reviewed journals. But real nonetheless. Valid in the way that direct experience is always valid, even when it can't be adequately communicated to others. And if enough people do this, if enough of us experiment with silence and sensitivity and somatic awareness, eventually patterns will emerge. Common experiences will be documented. Techniques will be refined and shared. We might collectively remember something. We might recover a capacity that's been dormant. We might become slightly more than we are now, or rather, fully what we've always had the potential to be. That's the deepest hope hidden in this narrative. Not that the past was better, but that it contained possibilities we can reclaim. Not that we should regress, but that we can integrate. Not that ancient wisdom is perfect, but that it's worth studying, testing, and learning from. The future doesn't have to be a straight line extrapolating from the present. It can curve back, spiraling, picking up threads from the past and weaving them into something new. It can be a future where technology and somatic practice coexist, where linguistic thought and bodily knowing complement each other, where we're individuals when that serves us and resonant when that serves us, fluid in our modes of consciousness rather than locked into one. It can be a future where loneliness is less prevalent because connection operates through multiple channels, not just symbolic ones, where healing draws on both pharmaceutical precision and vibrational therapy, where we understand ourselves as both symbolic processors and vibrational systems, mind and body fully integrated rather than perpetually at odds. This is what's possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. And possibility is enough to work with. Possibility is where change begins. So here's my final invitation, the last thing I'll ask of you. Remember, not specific facts or theories or claims made in this narrative, but the feeling, the resonance, the sense that there's more to you and to human history than you've been told. Remember that your body knows things. That silence teaches. That vibration carries information. That you are, fundamentally, an instrument capable of receiving and transmitting frequencies that consciousness doesn't always register but that matter nonetheless. Remember that the past is prologue, not prison. That our ancestors were brilliant in their own ways. That their achievements aren't diminished by our different achievements, and ours aren't threatened by acknowledging theirs. Remember that you're part of a species that has been asking questions and seeking answers for hundreds of thousands of years. That the conversation didn't start with you and won't end with you, but that you're part of it, your experience and exploration contributing to the collective knowledge of what it means to be human. And remember to be patient. Change is slow. Capacities don't return overnight. Practices take time to develop, to refine, to integrate into daily life. But time is what you have. The rest of your life stretches ahead, full of opportunities to pay attention differently, to experiment with perception, to explore the edges of your own potential. What you do with that time is up to you. But now you have a different set of possibilities to consider, a different question to explore. Not just how should I live, but how might I perceive? What might I be capable of if I approached consciousness differently? These are good questions. Questions without final answers, but that's what makes them good. They stay alive. They keep generating new thoughts, new experiences, new possibilities. And if you find answers, provisional, personal answers that work for you, share them. Not as dogma, not as certainty, but as data points. As contributions to the collective experiment of figuring out what humans can do, can be, can become. We're all in this together, whether we realize it or not. All exploring the same basic questions from different angles. All trying to understand ourselves and our place in the vast unfolding of time and consciousness. And the more we share, the more we learn. Not just intellectually, but in the deep, embodied way that actually changes behavior and perception. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention, your curiosity, your willingness to consider ideas that don't fit neatly into conventional boxes. Thank you for resonating. And if you want to continue this exploration, if you want to encounter more stories that challenge and expand and invite you into deeper questions, you know what to do. Not for me, but for yourself. Because the algorithm learns what matters to you, what calls to you, what helps you remember. Tell me in the comments where you are, what this makes you think about, what you're noticing in your own experience. Not because I need to know, but because saying it makes it real, solidifies the insights that emerged while listening, connects you to others who are walking similar paths. We're building something here, all of us together. Not a belief system, not a movement, but a resonance. A frequency that some people recognize and respond to. A space for questions that official channels don't quite make room for. And that space grows with each person who enters it, who recognizes themselves in these stories, who feels permission to explore what they've always intuited but never quite named. So welcome. Stay as long as it serves you. Explore. Question. Test everything against your own experience. Keep what resonates and release what doesn't. And remember, the deepest knowing isn't spoken. It's felt. In silence. In bone. In the subtle vibrations that connect all things, all beings, all moments in the vast symphony of existence. You're part of that symphony. You always have been. You just might have forgotten how to hear it. But you can remember. We all can. One breath at a time. One moment of attention at a time. One quiet exploration of what the body knows and the mind has ignored. That's how it begins. That's how we remember. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But enough. Always enough. Rest well. Dream deep. And when you wake, maybe you'll notice something you've been feeling all along but never quite registered. The world humming. Your body answering. The ancient conversation continuing. Waiting for you to consciously join. It's always been there. You're always been part of it. Now you just know. And knowing changes everything. Good night. Before you drift away completely, before sleep claims you or before you move on to whatever comes next, let's sit together for just a moment longer. Not to add new information, you've had enough of that. But to settle. To integrate. To let everything you've heard find its place in the architecture of your understanding. Think about the journey we've taken. We started with a simple question. What if ancient humans communicated through bone vibrations? A question that seemed almost whimsical, speculative, perhaps impossible. But as we explored, as we examined bone flutes and painted caves, acoustic properties of ancient sites and traditions of vibrational healing, the biology of resonance and the anthropology of indigenous practices, the question transformed. It became not did they, but how could they not? With sensitivity honed by silence. With bodies optimized for detecting subtle variations. With thousands of years to experiment and refine techniques. With direct observation unmediated by theoretical frameworks that declared certain things impossible. Of course they explored vibration. Of course they developed sophisticated understanding of resonance. Of course they used these insights for communication, healing, navigation, community bonding. The only question is how much we've lost. How complete was the transition from somatic knowing to symbolic thought? How much of the old system persists in latent form? How much could be recovered with intention and practice? And those questions don't have definitive answers yet. They're open questions, alive questions, questions that invite your participation rather than passive acceptance. This is where the story differs from traditional history. Traditional history tells you what happened. It presents evidence and interpretation and asks you to understand. This story asks you to explore, to test, to see what happens when you take the ideas seriously enough to try them, when you treat your own experience as valid data rather than mere anecdote. And that's uncomfortable. It's easier to consume information than to experiment with perception. It's safer to learn about the world than to discover you might not understand yourself as well as you thought. But discomfort is where growth lives. Uncertainty is where possibility emerges. And right now, you're in that space. You've absorbed ideas that don't quite fit your previous understanding. You're feeling something: curiosity, skepticism, resonance, resistance, maybe all of these simultaneously. That's perfect. That's exactly where you should be. Not convinced, not dismissive, but engaged. Wondering. Open. Stay there. Don't rush to resolution. Don't force yourself to decide whether this is all true or all false. Reality is rarely that simple. Instead, live with the questions. Notice what happens in the coming days when you're in quiet places. Pay attention to sensations you normally ignore. See if anything shifts in how you experience your body, your environment, your connections with others. You might notice nothing, and that's fine. That's data too, evidence that either the ideas don't apply to you, or that your habituation is stronger than a single story can shift, or that you need different practices or more time. Or you might notice something small. A moment when you sense something before you consciously hear it. A time when you feel connected to someone without words passing between you. An instant when a place seems to resonate with you in ways that aren't quite visual or auditory. Don't dismiss these moments. Don't rush to explain them away. Just note them. Acknowledge them. Let them accumulate. Because that's how knowing builds. Not through dramatic revelation, but through patient accumulation of subtle experiences that eventually add up to a different understanding. Our ancestors knew this. Their traditions weren't taught through lectures but through practice, repetition, embodied learning over years and decades. You didn't understand by being told. You understood by doing, feeling, experiencing directly until knowledge became part of your body. We've lost that patience. We want instant understanding, clear explanations, knowledge we can possess without transformation. But some knowledge can't be possessed that way. Some knowledge requires you to change, to become the kind of person who can perceive what you couldn't perceive before. And that takes time, takes practice, takes the willingness to look foolish, to try things that might not work, to trust your direct experience even when you can't explain it to others. This is the real challenge. Not intellectual, you're smart enough to understand the concepts, but experiential, embodied, requiring forms of courage that our culture doesn't typically value or reward. But maybe you have that courage. Maybe you're willing to be the experiment, to see what happens when you take seriously the possibility that your body knows more than your mind acknowledges. So you're not alone. There are others scattered across the world, exploring similar territories. Not organized into a movement, not following a leader or doctrine, but individually and collectively wondering, testing, discovering. You're part of that now, whether you intended to be or not. By listening this far, by engaging with these ideas, you've entered a conversation that's been happening in the margins of official culture for decades, centuries, millennia. The conversation about what humans are, what we've been, what we might become. The conversation that doesn't assume we've reached our final form, that believes potential remains untapped, that treats the past as a resource rather than a relic. And your contribution matters. Your experiments, your experiences, your willingness to explore, these add to the collective knowledge. These help us all understand more clearly what's possible, what's recoverable, what's worth pursuing. So take this seriously, not with grim determination, but with playful curiosity. Explore, notice, pay attention, see what happens. And if nothing happens, that's fine too. You've spent an evening considering fascinating ideas about human history and potential. You've exercised your imagination. You've practiced thinking about familiar phenomena in unfamiliar ways. That alone is valuable. That alone makes you more flexible, more open, more capable of seeing connections others miss. But if something does happen, if you do notice shifts in your perception, if you do experience moments of knowing that don't come through normal channels, then something begins. Not a religion, not a belief system, just an exploration. A personal investigation into the nature of consciousness and the capacities of your particular body-mind system. And wherever that exploration leads, whatever you discover or don't discover, you'll know something true about yourself. You'll have engaged with reality directly, tested ideas against experience, trusted your own perception enough to see where it leads. That's rare. That's precious. That's the kind of empirical curiosity that drives all genuine discovery, whether in science or spirituality or art. So honor it. Honor your curiosity. Honor your willingness to consider uncomfortable possibilities. Honor the part of you that resonates with these stories about ancient knowledge and forgotten capacities. That part of you is real, is valid, is pointing toward something, even if you can't yet articulate what. Follow it, gently, patiently, without forcing conclusions or demanding immediate results. Follow it into silence, into sensation, into the subtle vibrations that are always present but rarely noticed. Follow it until you find what you're looking for, or until you find something else entirely, something you didn't know you needed to find. Either way, you'll have traveled, you'll have explored, you'll have lived as an active participant in the mystery rather than a passive consumer of explanations. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. So rest now. Let these ideas settle. Let your unconscious mind process what your conscious mind has been considering. Dreams might come. Strange ones, vivid ones, dreams where you're in caves or ancient places, where communication happens without words, where you remember things you've never learned. Or dreams might not come. You might simply sleep, deeply and peacefully, refreshed by the mental journey you've taken through time and possibility. Either way, when you wake, something will have shifted. Maybe imperceptibly, maybe profoundly. But nothing is ever quite the same after you've genuinely considered that reality might be larger, stranger, more full of potential than you'd previously imagined. You've considered that now. You've opened that door. Where it leads is up to you. But know this, you're always welcome back. These ideas, these questions, this exploration, they're not going anywhere. They'll be here whenever you need them. Whenever you're ready to go deeper. Whenever you want to remember that humans are more mysterious and magnificent than any simple story can capture. We're symphonies, vibrations, patterns of energy and information that somehow became conscious, somehow learned to reflect on our own nature, somehow persist in wondering what else we might be capable of. And that wondering is holy. That curiosity is sacred. That willingness to question and explore and remain uncertain, that's the essence of what makes us human. Never lose it. Never let the world convince you that all the important questions have been answered, that reality is smaller than it feels, that you should stop wondering and just accept what you're told. Keep wondering. Keep questioning. Keep listening with your whole being, not just your ears. And maybe, just maybe, you'll hear something that changes everything. Something ancient. Something true. Something that was always there, waiting for you to remember. Welcome home. Let's go deeper now. Let's explore what we haven't yet touched. The practical implications, the specific techniques, the documented cases that blur the line between possible and impossible. Because if bone vibration communication was real, if it was a functional technology rather than metaphor or imagination, then there should be traces. Not just in mythology and monuments, but in living practice. In techniques that survived because they worked regardless of whether anyone understood why. And there are such techniques, scattered across cultures, preserved in traditions that seem unrelated until you recognize the common thread. They all work with vibration, with resonance, with the body as instrument and receiver. Let's start with something concrete, something you can verify, the phenomenon of bone conduction in modern technology. If you've ever used bone conduction headphones, you know the experience is uncanny. The speakers don't go in your ears. They rest against your cheekbones or behind your ears. They vibrate, and somehow you hear music, voices, sounds with perfect clarity even though nothing is entering your ear canals. The sound is traveling through your skull directly to your inner ear, bypassing the eardrum entirely. And for many people, it sounds clearer, more intimate than normal headphones. The music seems to come from inside your head, part of you rather than external. This technology was developed for people with hearing impairments, for situations where normal hearing isn't possible. But it's based on a principle that's always been part of human biology. We can hear through our bones. In fact, this is how we hear our own voices. When you speak, you hear yourself both through air conduction, sound waves traveling from your mouth to your ears, and through bone conduction, vibrations traveling through your skull from your vocal cords to your inner ear. This is why recordings of your voice sound wrong to you. You're only hearing the air conduction part, missing the bone conduction that makes your voice sound richer and deeper to yourself. But here's what's interesting. Bone conduction isn't just about hearing. It's about feeling. When someone with bone conduction headphones listens to music with heavy bass, they don't just hear it. They feel it resonating through their skull, their jaw, sometimes down into their chest. The experience is more immersive, more embodied than normal listening. It's not just auditory information. It's somatic experience. Now imagine you didn't have conventional headphones as an option. Imagine you lived 40,000 years ago, and you wanted to communicate complex information to someone nearby. Speaking works, but voices don't carry far. And in dangerous environments, loud vocalization attracts predators. But you have bone flutes, you have drums, you have instruments that create vibrations at specific frequencies, and you have the biological capacity for bone conduction. Would you figure out that you could communicate more privately, more efficiently through vibration? That if you held a vibrating object against your skull or chest, you could receive information that others nearby couldn't detect? The evidence suggests yes. Not conclusive proof, but suggestive patterns that keep appearing across unrelated cultures. In traditional Hawaiian culture, there's a practice called ha breathing, a technique where healers place their mouth against the patient's body and breathe in specific rhythms while vocalizing low tones. The practice is said to transfer mana, life force, or spiritual energy. Western observers dismissed this as superstition, primitive belief in magical energy transfer. But when researchers actually measured what was happening, they found something interesting. The healer's vocalizations create vibrations that penetrate deep into the patient's tissues. The frequencies used, primarily between 40 to 80 Hz, match the resonant frequencies of various organs and body structures. And the breathing patterns synchronize the patient's breath with the healer's, creating physiological coherence between them. The mana being transferred isn't mystical energy. It's rhythmic, vibrational information that affects the patient's physiology directly. The technique works because human bodies respond to specific frequencies in measurable ways. And the technique is old. How old, we don't know, but Hawaiian oral traditions suggest it predates their arrival on the islands, that it was brought from wherever they came from before. Similar practices exist in Polynesian cultures across the Pacific. In Maori tradition, it's called hakoa. In Tahitian practice, it's part of Turumi healing. The details vary, but the core principle remains. Vibration transmitted through close contact, often mouth to skin, using specific frequencies and rhythms. Why mouth to skin? Because the lips are extraordinarily sensitive, capable of detecting minute variations in tissue tension and temperature. And the mouth can generate sustained vibrations that hands cannot, while remaining precise and controlled. The healer is using their own body as a diagnostic and therapeutic instrument, reading and influencing the patient's physiological state through vibration. This isn't unique to Polynesian cultures. In traditional Chinese medicine, there's a diagnostic technique called palpation that goes far beyond what Western doctors mean by the term. Advanced practitioners claim to feel not just pulse and temperature, but the quality of qi flowing through the body. Skeptics say this is impossible, that they're reading subtle body language or using cold reading techniques. But studies have shown that experienced practitioners can detect differences in tissue state, inflammation, fluid accumulation, muscle tension, with remarkable accuracy. often before these conditions become obvious through other diagnostic methods. How? They're not using mystical perception. They're using highly trained somatic sensitivity, the ability to detect subtle variations in vibration and resistance when they touch the body. And this sensitivity can be trained. Studies have shown that musicians, particularly string players, develop enhanced tactile sensitivity in their fingertips. Blind people often develop extraordinary tactile and auditory perception. Martial artists develop the ability to sense movement and intention through minimal contact. The nervous system is plastic. It adapts to what you demand of it. If you spend thousands of hours training your body to detect subtle vibrations, subtle pressures, subtle changes in the people and environment around you, you will develop that capacity. It's not magic. It's neurology. It's the same process that allows London taxi drivers to develop enlarged hippocampi or allows polyglots to process multiple languages efficiently. The question isn't whether such training is possible. The question is, did our ancestors, who had nothing but time and silence and the demands of survival, develop these sensitivities to extraordinary degrees? And if they did, what could they accomplish that we no longer can? There's a documented phenomenon in twin studies called twin telepathy or cryptophagia. Twins, particularly identical twins raised together, sometimes report knowing when their sibling is in distress, feeling their pain, or understanding their thoughts without communication. Skeptics attribute this entirely to shared experience, similar thought patterns, unconscious signaling. And certainly those factors contribute. But there are cases, documented, verified cases, where twins separated by significant distances react simultaneously to events affecting one of them. A twin has an accident, and the other wakes up at that moment, sensing something wrong. A twin goes into labor, and the other experiences phantom contractions. A twin dies, and the other knows immediately, before any notification. These cases are rare and hard to study rigorously, but they persist across cultures and throughout recorded history. And they suggest something, that people who share deep biological and psychological connection, who literally develop together in the womb, might maintain some form of correlation that we don't yet understand. Not mystical connection, but perhaps sensitivity to signals that most people don't notice. Subtle changes in their own physiology that reflect their twin state through mechanisms we haven't mapped. Or perhaps, and this is pure speculation, they maintain some form of resonant coupling, their nervous systems attuned to each other at such a fundamental level that major disturbances in one create detectable echoes in the other. We don't know. But the phenomenon is documented widely enough that dismissing it entirely requires ignoring a lot of consistent testimony. And if twins can maintain this kind of connection, what about people who deliberately train to synchronize their physiology with others? What about communities that spend generations developing practices of collective resonance? In some monastic traditions, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, there are accounts of communities achieving states of collective consciousness during sustained practice. Not mystical unity, but literal physiological synchronization. Their breathing aligns, their heart rates converge, their brain waves enter similar patterns. Modern researchers studying group meditation have documented this. Put experienced meditators in a room together, have them practice in silence, and their physiologies begin to synchronize. Not perfectly, not completely, but measurably. They become, in some sense, a coherent system rather than isolated individuals. And in these states, people report enhanced sensitivity to each other. The ability to sense when someone is struggling, when someone needs support, when the collective energy, their term, but it maps to physiological coherence, is strong or weak. Is this bone vibration communication? Not directly. But it's something related, the capacity for human nervous systems to influence each other through channels that aren't linguistic, that operate below conscious awareness but affect experience and behavior nonetheless. And if this capacity exists in humans now, with minimal training, living in noisy modern environments, what did it look like in ancestral populations that spent their entire lives in natural silence, that raised children to be sensitive to subtle signals, that organized their entire cultures around collective practices of rhythm and resonance? We can only speculate, but the speculation is grounded in documented phenomena, in capacities we know humans possess, extrapolated to contexts where those capacities would have been far more developed. Let's examine specific archaeological sites where the evidence for intentional acoustic engineering becomes almost undeniable. Newgrange in Ireland is approximately 5,200 years old, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. It's a passage tomb, a massive mound of earth and stone with a narrow corridor leading to a central chamber. For most of the year, the interior is completely dark. But on the winter solstice, sunlight penetrates through a specially designed opening and illuminates the chamber for exactly 17 minutes. This astronomical precision alone is remarkable for a Neolithic culture. But there's more. Researchers studying Newgrange discovered that the chamber has extraordinary acoustic properties. Its dimensions and materials create a resonant frequency of approximately 110 Hz, a frequency that modern neuroscience has shown affects human brain activity in specific ways. When subjects are exposed to 110 Hz, brain scans show decreased activity in the language centers and increased activity in areas associated with emotional processing, intuition, and what researchers call the sense of presence, the feeling that someone or something else is nearby. At Newgrange, this frequency would have been generated by drums, voices, or other instruments, and everyone in the chamber would have been bathed in vibrations that literally altered their brain state, shifting consciousness away from linguistic thought toward more emotional, intuitive, potentially more collectively synchronized modes. Was this intentional? The builders left no written records, but the precision of the astronomical alignment suggests they knew exactly what they were doing. And if they could engineer that level of precision for solar events, why not for acoustic events? Other ancient sites show similar patterns. At Hal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta, an underground temple complex over 5,000 years old, there's a chamber called the Oracle Room. When someone speaks or chants in this room at certain frequencies, around 110 Hz again, the sound resonates powerfully throughout the entire complex. But it does more than resonate. It creates standing waves, patterns of vibration that concentrate in specific locations. Stand in those spots and you don't just hear the sound, you feel it viscerally vibrating through your body with an intensity that's almost overwhelming. The builders carved this complex out of solid limestone using primitive tools. The labor required was enormous. Why would they do this unless the acoustic properties served some important function? Modern engineers, examining the structure, say the acoustic effects couldn't be accidental. The chambers are too precisely shaped, the materials too carefully selected. Someone understood how sound behaves in enclosed spaces and designed accordingly. But according to standard history, the people who built this had no scientific understanding of acoustics, no mathematical framework for understanding wave behavior, no reason to care about sonic resonance in underground chambers. Unless sonic resonance was central to their practices. Unless these weren't just tombs or temples in the modern sense, but acoustic instruments, places where sound could be used for communication, ritual, healing, or purposes we can't fully reconstruct. In the Chavín de Huántar temple complex in Peru, dating to around 1500 BCE, archaeologists discovered an intricate system of underground passages designed to channel sound. These acoustic corridors connect various chambers and allow sound from central locations to be heard throughout the complex, even though the speakers remain invisible. Imagine the effect. You're in a dark chamber, and suddenly you hear a voice, seemingly coming from the walls themselves, from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The voice speaks or sings at frequencies that resonate through the stone, through your body. You can't see the source, can't identify the speaker, can only feel and hear this disembodied communication. The psychological impact would be profound. The architects understood this. They engineered spaces that created specific experiences, that manipulated perception through sound and vibration. And they did this without oscilloscopes, without acoustic modeling software, without the theoretical framework of modern physics. They did it through direct observation and experimentation, through generations of refining technique and passing knowledge from builders to apprentices, which suggests that their culture valued this knowledge highly enough to invest enormous resources in its application. Sound and vibration weren't peripheral concerns. They were central to how these societies understood and organized reality. At Carnac in France, there are thousands of standing stones arranged in long rows stretching for miles. The conventional explanation is that they served astronomical or ceremonial purposes, though their exact function remains mysterious. But recent studies have found something interesting. The stones are positioned such that certain sound frequencies create interference patterns across the site. At specific frequencies, particularly around 70 to 120 Hz, standing in certain positions creates the sensation that the stones themselves are vibrating or humming. The effect is subtle but measurable, and it only works at specific frequencies and specific locations. The positioning appears deliberate, too precise to be coincidental. Why? What purpose could this serve? Unless the builders understood that these vibrations affected human physiology and consciousness, that positioning stones to create vibrational patterns was functionally important for whatever activities took place at the site. We're seeing the same pattern at prehistoric sites worldwide. Acoustic properties that seem too sophisticated to be accidental, too consistent to be coincidental, yet built by cultures we believe had no formal understanding of sound physics. The explanation that fits the evidence. They understood sound very well. Not theoretically, not mathematically, but practically. They knew what worked because they observed, experimented, and refined over generations. And they invested enormous resources, labor, materials, time, in creating acoustic environments because those environments served crucial functions in their societies. If those functions were primarily linguistic, if ancient sites were just places where people gathered to talk, then the acoustic engineering seems excessive. Normal speech doesn't require resonant chambers at 110 Hz or standing stones positioned to create interference patterns. But if communication operated partially through vibration, if collective practices relied on physiological synchronization through resonance, if healing and ritual and social cohesion all depended on precise acoustic environments, then the investment makes sense. These sites were infrastructure, as important to their cultures as telecommunications networks are to ours. Different technology, different principles, but serving similar needs: connection, coordination, collective consciousness. In Aboriginal Australian culture, there's a tradition of message sticks, carved wooden objects that serve as communication between groups. The standard interpretation is that the carvings are symbolic, encoding information visually. But some researchers have noted that the sticks are often made from specific types of wood with excellent resonant properties. And the carvings aren't just decorative. They create ridges and textures that affect how the stick vibrates when struck or rubbed. Traditional carriers would sometimes strike the message stick against their body while traveling, creating rhythms. The rhythms would vary depending on the stick's carvings, essentially encoding information vibrationally as well as visually. When they arrived at their destination, the recipient would examine the stick visually, yes, but also often tap or strike it, listening to how it sounded. Some accounts suggest they could read the message vibrationally, understanding content from the pattern of sounds the stick produced. This isn't confirmed. The practice largely died out before anthropologists could study it rigorously. But the accounts persist, and they suggest a complementary system. Visual symbols for those who could see them, vibrational patterns for those who could feel and hear them. A redundant communication system, ensuring messages could be transmitted and received through multiple channels. Sophisticated, practical, and entirely consistent with a culture that understood vibration as a carrier of information. In Tuvan throat singing, a tradition from Central Asia, singers produce multiple pitches simultaneously, a fundamental tone and overtones that can be isolated and controlled independently. The effect is uncanny. One person sounding like multiple voices, creating harmonies with themselves. Throat singing requires extreme control of the vocal apparatus and years of practice to master. But those who achieve mastery report something interesting. They don't just hear the overtones, they feel them resonating in different parts of their body depending on the frequency. Low overtones vibrate the chest. Mid-range overtones vibrate the throat and face. High overtones vibrate the skull and sinuses. Skilled singers can play their body like an instrument, directing vibrations to specific locations deliberately. And when multiple throat singers perform together, creating complex interference patterns of fundamental tones and overtones, everyone present reports feeling the vibrations, experiencing the music not just auditorily but somatically. The tradition is ancient. How ancient, no one knows, but references to similar practices appear in texts over 1,000 years old. And it's preserved not because it sounds pretty, though it does, but because it serves functions in Tuvan culture: healing, spiritual practice, storytelling. The songs often accompany myths and histories, but experienced listeners say the overtones carry additional information beyond the words: emotional content, energetic signatures, aspects of meaning that can't be captured linguistically. Is this bone vibration communication? It's close. It's deliberate use of complex vocal vibrations to transmit information through somatic rather than purely auditory channels. It's proof that humans can develop extraordinary control over the vibrational qualities of their vocalization when culture values and trains that capacity. And if this level of sophistication exists in a tradition that survived into modernity, what existed in traditions that didn't survive? What techniques were lost when cultures were disrupted? When oral traditions died with their carriers? When practices were suppressed or simply forgotten? Let's talk about water. Because water, it turns out, might be crucial to understanding how vibrational communication could have worked. The human body is approximately 60% water by weight, but that number doesn't capture the full picture. At the cellular level, we're even more liquid. Our cells are mostly water. Our blood is mostly water. Our brains are about 75% water. And water has extraordinary properties when it comes to vibration. It's an excellent conductor of sound. Sound travels about 4 times faster through water than through air. It's responsive to vibration. You've seen this if you've ever watched ripples propagate across a pond or observed cymatics demonstrations where sound creates patterns in water. But water in the body isn't like water in a glass. It's structured water, held in complex arrangements by cell membranes and proteins and dissolved minerals. And structured water behaves differently than bulk water. Some researchers, controversial ones, working at the edges of mainstream science, suggest that structured water might be able to store information in the form of vibrational patterns. That the molecular arrangement of water can be influenced by vibration and might maintain that arrangement for significant periods, essentially encoding memory at the molecular level. This is highly speculative and not accepted by most scientists. But even skeptics acknowledge that water molecules do arrange themselves in response to vibration, and those arrangements do affect the water's properties. Now imagine, human bodies are mostly water. If vibration affects water structure, then the vibrations we're constantly exposed to, from our own voices, from environmental sounds, from the vibrations of other people nearby, are constantly affecting the molecular structure of the water that comprises most of our body. Most of these effects are probably transient, meaningless. But what if certain patterns, certain frequencies, create more stable structures? What if those structures affect the function of the cells they're part of? Then vibration wouldn't just be something we hear or feel temporarily. It would be something that literally shapes our biological functioning at the molecular level. This might sound like pseudoscience, but consider, we know that mechanical stress affects cell behavior. Stem cells, for instance, differentiate into different cell types partly based on the physical forces acting on them. Bone cells respond to mechanical loading by becoming stronger. Even cancer cells behave differently depending on the mechanical properties of their environment. If cells respond to mechanical forces, why not to vibration, which is just periodic mechanical force? And if they respond, what information might be encoded in those responses? Cymatics, the study of visible sound, demonstrates that vibration creates order in disordered media. Play a tone through a plate covered with sand, and the sand arranges itself into geometric patterns. Change the frequency, and the pattern changes instantly. The patterns aren't random. They're mathematically precise, predictable, reproducible. Sound creates structure. Now consider, our bodies are fluid systems held in dynamic equilibrium. We're not solid and stable, we're constantly flowing, changing, maintained in a particular form through continuous process rather than fixed structure. What role does vibration play in maintaining that form? What information do the rhythms of heartbeat, breathing, peristalsis, and neural oscillation carry about how the body should organize itself? And if external vibrations, sounds, voices, resonances from other people, can influence those internal rhythms, then communication through vibration isn't just about transmitting information from one consciousness to another. It's about directly affecting the physiological state of the receiver. This is how lullabies work. A mother singing to an infant isn't just producing pleasant sounds. She's entraining the baby's physiology with her own. The rhythm of the song matches breathing rates that promote calm and sleep. The frequencies used stimulate parasympathetic nervous system activity. The vibrations, transmitted through physical contact as much as through air, directly soothe the child's body. Every culture has lullabies. They all work on similar principles: slow tempo, repetitive melody, frequencies that resonate with infant physiology. This isn't cultural invention, it's biological discovery. Mothers across millennia figured out what sounds calm babies because babies responded predictably to certain vibrational patterns. If this works for lullabies, what else works? What other physiological states can be influenced by specific vibrational patterns? Traditional cultures have answers. War chants that increase aggression and courage. Funeral songs that facilitate grief and acceptance. Work songs that synchronize group effort and reduce perception of fatigue. Healing songs that somehow, through mechanisms not fully understood, seem to aid recovery from illness. We've tended to explain these psychologically: the meaning of the songs, the cultural context, the placebo effect, and those factors matter. But what if there's also a direct physiological mechanism? What if the vibrational patterns themselves affect autonomic function, immune response, neural activity in ways that support the intended outcome? Then these songs aren't just culturally meaningful, they're functionally powerful. They're technology encoded in sound, passed down through oral tradition because they worked, regardless of whether anyone understood why. In Mongolian culture, there's a practice of singing to horses, specific songs for specific purposes. Songs to calm a frightened horse, songs to energize a tired one, songs to help a mare bond with a newborn foal. Horsemen insist these songs work, that horses respond to the specific vibrational patterns in ways that go beyond the psychological comfort of familiar human voice, that the songs affect the animals physiologically, altering their nervous system state directly. Skeptics dismiss this as anthropomorphism, as confirmation bias from people who want their traditions to seem magical. But horse physiology isn't that different from human physiology. If certain frequencies affect human autonomic function, they might affect horses similarly. And horsemen, people who spend their entire lives in close contact with horses, observing minute changes in behavior, learning what works through thousands of hours of direct experience, might have discovered real effects that laboratory science hasn't bothered to study rigorously. This pattern appears everywhere. Traditional practitioners claiming that specific sounds or vibrations have specific effects, skeptics dismissing these claims as superstition, and very few people actually testing whether there might be real physiological mechanisms underneath the cultural framework. What if we tested systematically? What if we took the traditional knowledge seriously enough to investigate whether the vibrational patterns used in healing songs, in horse songs, in whale hunting songs, yes, some cultures have these too, in countless other context-specific vocalizations, what if we investigated whether these patterns consistently produce measurable physiological effects? We might find nothing. Cultural practices don't always have functional bases. Sometimes things persist simply because they're traditional, meaningful, identity-forming. But we might find something. We might discover that certain patterns do reliably affect nervous system activity, immune function, pain perception, emotional state. We might find that our ancestors were conducting systematic experiments in applied psychophysiology for thousands of years, encoding their discoveries in songs and practices that survived because they worked. And if we found that, if we validated even a fraction of traditional acoustic practices as physiologically functional, it would transform our understanding of human capability. Because it would mean that humans, without modern technology, without theoretical frameworks, discovered principles of human biology that we're only now beginning to understand. And they discovered them through direct observation, through paying attention to cause and effect at a level of subtlety we rarely achieve in our noisy, distracted age. They discovered them because they had time, because they lived in silence that let them notice subtle effects, because knowledge accumulated over generations, each one refining the techniques inherited from the last. And they encoded their discoveries not in books but in practices, not in abstract knowledge but in embodied skill, transmitted teacher to student through demonstration and direct experience. Most of that knowledge is gone now, lost when cultures died, when languages disappeared, when the last practitioner of a tradition passed without students to carry it forward. But fragments remain, and those fragments suggest that the whole was vast, sophisticated, effective in ways that should humble us. We're not recovering ancient wisdom to reject modernity. Modern medicine saves lives that traditional practices couldn't. Modern technology extends human capability in ways our ancestors couldn't imagine. But perhaps we could integrate, perhaps we could add traditional understanding of vibration and resonance to our toolkit, not replacing scientific medicine but complementing it. Using the best of both. The precision and power of modern technology with the subtlety and sophistication of traditional practice. That integration is starting to happen in some places. Sound healing is being studied more rigorously. Music therapy is gaining acceptance for neurological conditions. Vibration therapy is used in physical rehabilitation. But we're still at the beginning, still barely scratching the surface of what might be possible if we took seriously the idea that vibration is a powerful influence on biological systems, and that humans once understood this in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. There's a question we haven't fully addressed. Why? Why would evolution favor bone vibration communication? What advantage did it provide that would lead to its development and refinement? The answer might lie in the environments our ancestors inhabited and the challenges they faced. Consider the African savanna 200,000 years ago, where anatomically modern humans first emerged. It's a dangerous place. Predators everywhere. Lions, leopards, hyenas, crocodiles near water. Survival requires constant vigilance, sophisticated cooperation, the ability to communicate danger and opportunity rapidly. But audible communication has limitations. Voices carry, yes, but they also alert predators to your location. Shout a warning about a lion, and you might attract the lion's attention. Coordinate a hunt with loud discussion, and you alert your prey. Visual signals work, but only line of sight, only in adequate light. Touch requires close proximity. Scent is too slow and imprecise for complex information. But low-frequency vibration travels well through ground, through stone, through any medium that conducts better than air. And it's directional. You can transmit to someone in physical contact with the same substrate without broadcasting to everyone within earshot. If you're hunting, moving through dangerous territory, or simply trying to maintain group cohesion without attracting attention, the ability to communicate through vibration would be enormously advantageous. And humans have the biological equipment. Our bones conduct vibration efficiently. Our sensitivity to touch and vibration is acute. Our capacity to produce controlled vocalizations is unmatched among primates. All the pieces are there. The question isn't whether bone vibration communication is possible. It clearly is. We use it in modern technology. The question is whether our ancestors developed it naturally, the way they developed complex spoken language. And there's suggestive evidence. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer communication show extensive use of nonverbal signals, clicking sounds that carry information about location and type of game, rhythmic tapping that coordinates group movement without verbal discussion. These practices might be remnants of more sophisticated vibrational communication systems, or they might be convergent evolution, different groups independently discovering that vibration is useful for covert communication. Either way, they demonstrate that humans naturally explore vibrational communication when circumstances favor it. It's not a huge leap to imagine that in the deep past, when survival pressures were more intense and generations had time to refine techniques, these explorations went much further. There's another evolutionary consideration: infant care. Human infants are extraordinarily dependent, requiring constant attention for years. Mothers in ancestral environments had to balance childcare with other survival activities: gathering food, processing materials, maintaining social relationships. Carrying the infant in constant physical contact solved many problems. The mother's body heat kept the infant warm. The movement and rhythms of her body soothed the child. And crucially, she could monitor the infant's state and respond immediately to distress. But physical contact also creates a vibrational channel. The infant, pressed against the mother's chest, feels her heartbeat, her breathing, the vibrations of her voice resonating through her body. These become the infant's primary sensory environment in early life, and infants respond to these vibrations. Their breathing synchronizes with their mother's. Their heart rate calms when held against her chest. They show stress responses when the mother's physiology indicates stress, even before any visible or audible signs. This is documented in modern developmental psychology. Babies are exquisitely sensitive to their caregiver's physiological state, perceiving and responding to information transmitted through touch, vibration, and other nonverbal channels. What if this capacity doesn't disappear with maturity but simply becomes less conscious as language development takes priority? What if the biological mechanisms for perceiving and responding to vibrational information remain intact, just shifted outside conscious awareness? Then training to bring those mechanisms back into conscious control wouldn't be developing a new capacity. It would be recovering access to one we've always had but stopped attending to. This might explain why practices like meditation, yoga, and various body awareness disciplines often report similar experiences across cultures. They're not inducing supernatural states. They're revealing natural capacities that modern life habitually suppresses. And it might explain why certain environments, caves, forests, mountains, oceans, consistently produce feelings of awe, presence, and connection across cultures. These environments have distinct vibrational signatures. They resonate in ways that urban environments don't. And our bodies recognize this, respond to it, even though we rarely bring the response into conscious awareness. You've probably experienced this. Walking in a forest and feeling your nervous system settle, your breathing deepen, your mind quiet. Standing on a beach and feeling the rhythm of waves synchronize with some internal rhythm. Sitting in a cave or ancient structure and feeling the space has presence, has character, has something that can't quite be named. We attribute these experiences to psychology, to aesthetics, to the break from normal routine. And those factors contribute. But what if there's also a direct physiological response to the vibrational environment? What if our bodies recognize and respond to acoustic signatures that consciousness doesn't consciously process? Then our ancestors, who spent their entire lives in these environments, who never experienced the constant acoustic noise of modernity, would have been far more aware of these effects. They would have noticed which caves felt right, which forests calmed or energized, which stone formations seemed to resonate with human presence. And they would have marked these places, used them for important activities, built structures that enhanced or modified the natural resonances, encoded their knowledge of these places in myths and traditions so future generations would continue using them. This is exactly what we see in the archaeological record. Sacred sites at locations with unusual acoustic properties. Structures that enhance natural resonances. Traditions that insist certain places are powerful, special, suitable for particular activities. We've interpreted this spiritually. These places have sacred energy, divine presence, connection to the spirit world. But what if the original understanding was more practical? These places have acoustic properties that affect human physiology in specific ways, making them suitable for healing, for collective ritual, for practices that require altered consciousness. The spiritual interpretation came later, when the practical knowledge faded, when people no longer consciously understood why these places worked but maintained traditions of using them because the effects, however mysterious, were real. This isn't to dismiss spirituality or reduce sacred experiences to mere physics. The experiences are real and meaningful regardless of mechanism. But understanding the mechanism doesn't diminish the experience. It deepens our appreciation of how sophisticated ancestral knowledge was. They weren't primitive people attributing natural phenomena to supernatural forces. They were sophisticated observers who noticed, tested, and systematically applied understanding of how environment affects human physiology and consciousness. They were scientists in their way, not using our methods, not framing understanding in our terms, but engaging in empirical investigation and practical application of discovered principles. And we've lost most of that knowledge. Not because it was wrong, but because it was oral, embodied, tied to specific places and practices. When cultures were disrupted, when traditions were suppressed or simply died out, the knowledge died with them. What remains are fragments, tantalizing hints that the whole was far more impressive than we've generally acknowledged. Let's address the difficult question. If all this is true, if bone vibration communication was real and sophisticated, why isn't there clearer evidence? Why don't we have written records describing the techniques? Why aren't there unambiguous artifacts that prove the practice? The answer lies in the nature of the knowledge itself. Bone vibration communication, if it existed, would have been embodied knowledge, skills developed through practice, transmitted through demonstration, impossible to fully capture in words or artifacts. Think about riding a bicycle. You can describe it verbally. Balance on two wheels, pedal with your feet, steer with the handlebars. But that description doesn't convey the actual skill. The only way to learn is to try, to fall, to gradually develop the motor patterns and balance responses that constitute the ability. Now imagine a future archaeologist, finding a bicycle thousands of years from now with no living practitioners to demonstrate its use. They might figure out it's for transportation. They might understand the mechanical principles. But they wouldn't truly comprehend what it's like to ride, how the skill feels, what mastery enables. Bone vibration communication would be similar, a skill that could be described but not fully conveyed through description alone. The written records we'd need to prove it conclusively couldn't exist because writing is inadequate to capture embodied knowledge. The artifacts would be ambiguous. Flutes, drums, resonant chambers, they all have conventional explanations. Nothing about them screams, "This was used for vibrational communication," unless you already know to look for that. It's like finding stone tools and trying to deduce from them alone that humans had language. The tools show intelligence, planning, cultural transmission. But they don't prove language. Language has to be inferred from indirect evidence, from the complexity of coordination required to create certain artifacts, from the pace of cultural change, from comparative biology. Bone vibration communication, if real, would leave similar traces. Not proof, but patterns. Acoustic engineering that seems too sophisticated for cultures without theoretical frameworks. Practices involving vibration that persist across cultures. Biological capacities that seem overdeveloped if they serve no function. And that's what we have. Patterns that are suggestive but not conclusive. Evidence that supports the hypothesis but doesn't prove it definitively. This is frustrating if you want certainty. But it's realistic given the nature of what we're investigating. Most of human experience leaves no direct trace. Thoughts, emotions, skills, practices. These exist and matter enormously but don't fossilize, don't get carved in stone, don't survive in forms that archaeologists can definitively interpret. We know ancient peoples had rich inner lives, complex social relationships, sophisticated understanding of their environments. But we know this inferentially, from the traces their activities left, not from direct access to their experience. Bone vibration communication would be the same. If it existed, we'd find exactly the kind of evidence we do find. Acoustic engineering at sacred sites, instruments with unusual acoustic properties, traditions involving vibrational healing and communication, biological capacities that seem primed for vibrational sensitivity. None of this proves the hypothesis, but all of it is consistent with it. And when a hypothesis is consistent with diverse evidence across multiple domains, archaeology, biology, anthropology, neuroscience, it becomes worth taking seriously even without definitive proof. Science advances not just through proof but through productive hypotheses. Ideas that make sense of existing evidence and suggest new investigations, new questions, new ways of understanding phenomena we've noticed but not fully explained. The bone vibration hypothesis does this. It makes sense of acoustic engineering at ancient sites. It explains why so many cultures developed sophisticated practices around sound and vibration. It provides evolutionary rationale for biological capacities that seem excessive if they serve only the functions we currently recognize. And it suggests investigations we could conduct. Studies of how vibration affects human physiology. Systematic documentation of traditional practices involving sound. Archaeological analysis of ancient sites for acoustic properties we haven't specifically looked for. Training programs to see whether vibrational sensitivity can be deliberately developed. Some of this research is happening, but most of it is marginal, underfunded, not taken seriously by mainstream institutions. Because the hypothesis itself isn't mainstream. It's not taught in textbooks. It's not part of the standard narrative about human evolution and cultural development. But that could change. Science has a history of ideas moving from fringe to mainstream when evidence accumulates beyond a certain threshold. Continental drift was ridiculed before it was accepted. The bacterial basis of ulcers was dismissed before it was proven. Neuroplasticity was considered impossible before it was documented. Bone vibration communication might follow a similar trajectory. Or it might not. The evidence might never reach the threshold for mainstream acceptance. But the investigation is worthwhile regardless. Because even if the grand hypothesis is wrong, the investigation will yield valuable knowledge. We'll learn more about how sound affects human biology. We'll better understand ancient acoustic engineering. We'll document traditional practices before they disappear entirely. We'll expand our sense of human capability and cultural diversity. And if the hypothesis is right, if even a portion of what it suggests turns out to be recoverable, the implications are profound. We'd have access to communication modalities we've largely forgotten. We'd understand therapeutic applications of vibration more deeply. We'd have new approaches to collective coordination and social cohesion. We'd recover a dimension of human experience that's been dormant for millennia. This wouldn't make us superhuman. It would make us more fully human, accessing more of the potential that's always been latent in our biology. And that's perhaps the real promise here. Not that we'll prove our ancestors were wizards or that we'll develop mystical powers, but that we'll expand our sense of what normal human capability includes, what we can do when we develop capacities that modern life doesn't typically cultivate. So the question isn't really, was bone vibration communication real? The question is, what happens if we take the possibility seriously enough to investigate systematically? And that question has no certain answer yet. It's open. It's inviting. It's calling to anyone curious enough, bold enough, patient enough to explore. Maybe that's you. Maybe you'll be part of the generation that recovers what was lost, or discovers that it was never lost, only forgotten, waiting for someone to remember. The tools are available. The knowledge is fragmentary but present. The biological capacity exists. All that's needed is attention, practice, and the willingness to trust experience over dogma. This is where the story ends and your story might begin. Not with certainty but with possibility. Not with answers but with questions that won't quite let go. What will you do with them? So here we are, truly at the end now. We've journeyed through 40,000 years, through caves and bones and frequencies, through the tension between what we think we know about human history and what the evidence whispers when we listen carefully. We've considered a possibility that challenges comfortable narratives, that our ancestors communicated in ways we've forgotten, that human capability is broader than modern life requires or cultivates, that the transition to linguistic consciousness came with costs we rarely acknowledge. And we've sat with uncertainty, with the discomfort of not knowing for sure, with the frustration of evidence that suggests but doesn't prove. This is where we live now, all of us trying to make sense of the past and our place in the vast unfolding of human story. We want certainty. We want to know what really happened, what's really possible, what we should believe. But certainty is rare in questions that matter. The important things, how to live, what to value, what humans are capable of, these resist final answers. They demand engagement, exploration, the willingness to hold complexity and contradiction without collapsing into premature conclusions. That's what this story has asked of you. To hold complexity. To consider possibilities that don't fit cleanly into accepted frameworks. To trust your own resonance with ideas even when you can't prove them definitively. And if you've made it this far, if you're still here after hours of speculation and evidence and philosophical reflection, then something resonated. Something in this narrative spoke to something in you that recognizes truth even when it can't be verified through conventional means. Trust that. Not blindly, remain skeptical, critical, demanding of evidence. But trust that your intuition, your bodily sense of rightness, is providing valid information even if it can't be translated into logical proof. Because that's what bone vibration communication would feel like if you experienced it. Not thinking someone's thoughts but sensing their state. Not hearing words but understanding meaning. Not processing information cognitively but knowing directly, immediately, in ways that bypass linguistic consciousness. And maybe you've felt hints of this already. Moments when you knew something without knowing how you knew. Times when you sensed emotion or intention in someone nearby without them speaking. Experiences of connection that seem to operate through channels deeper than conversation. We usually dismiss these experiences. Coincidence, we say. Lucky guess. Unconscious processing of body language. And maybe that's all they are. Or maybe they're glimpses of a capacity we all possess but rarely use consciously. Echoes of an older way of knowing that still functions beneath the surface of linguistic thought. The only way to find out is to pay attention. To notice these moments when they happen. To explore whether they become clearer, stronger, more reliable with practice and attention. This is the experiment I'm inviting you into. Not to believe what I've said, but to test it. To see what happens when you approach your own experience with curiosity about vibrational dimensions you might have been ignoring. Spend time in silence. Notice what you feel when you're near others without speaking. Pay attention to environments, which places calm you, which energize you, which seem to resonate with something in your body beyond visual or auditory beauty. Experiment with sound. Hum and feel where the vibration concentrates in your body. Try different frequencies, different vowel sounds, different volumes. Notice if anything changes in how you feel, how you think, how present you are in your body. These experiments cost nothing but attention. They require no special equipment, no training, no permission. Just willingness to pay attention differently than you usually do. And maybe you'll discover nothing. Maybe bone vibration communication is purely historical speculation, interesting but inaccessible to modern practitioners living in noisy environments with nervous systems optimized for linguistic processing. That's possible. Even likely. The past might be truly lost, recoverable only through academic study, not direct experience. But maybe you'll discover something. Maybe you'll find that when you're quiet, when you're attentive, when you trust somatic knowing, information flows through channels you hadn't noticed before. Maybe you'll experience moments of connection that seem impossible but are undeniably real. Maybe you'll find that your body knows more than your mind suspects, that consciousness is broader than linguistic thought, that being human includes possibilities we've been ignoring. And if you do find that, you'll join a quiet community of explorers. People across the world who are rediscovering embodied ways of knowing, who are remembering what indigenous cultures never forgot, who are finding that the future sometimes requires learning from the deep past. This community isn't organized. It has no leader, no doctrine, no official membership. It's simply people who've noticed something, who felt the pull toward older, deeper ways of being human, who are exploring on their own terms. You're part of it now, whether you intended to be or not. By listening this far, by engaging with these ideas, you've stepped into a conversation that's been happening in the margins for a long time. Welcome. Stay as long as it serves you. Take what resonates and leave what doesn't. And if you find something worth sharing, insights, experiences, practices that work, share them. Not as truth, but as data. As contributions to the collective exploration of what humans can be. Because that's what this is really about. Not proving ancient humans had specific capabilities, but expanding our sense of what humans, present-day humans, you and everyone listening, might be capable of if we developed capacities that modern culture doesn't typically cultivate. That's the real frontier. Not outer space, not artificial intelligence, not any external technology. But the inner frontier of human potential, the capacities that exist in latent form in every body, waiting to be awakened through attention and practice. Our ancestors explored this frontier. They mapped territories of consciousness and capability that we've lost touch with. But the territories still exist. The maps might be fragmentary, but they're not gone entirely. And we can explore again. We can remember. We can become more fully human by recovering capacities that human biology has always included but modern life doesn't require. This is the promise. This is the possibility. This is what all the evidence and speculation and storytelling has been pointing toward. Not certainty, not proof, but invitation to explore, to remember, to become more than you currently are by accessing more of what you've always been. The path is open. The practices exist, however fragmentary. The biological capacity is there. All that's needed is your attention, your curiosity, your willingness to trust experience over dogma. Will you explore? Will you test? Will you see what happens when you approach your own consciousness and capability with openness to dimensions you might have been ignoring? Only you can answer. Only you can take the step from listening to trying, from intellectual engagement to embodied exploration. But if you do, if you step onto this path, know that you're not alone. Others are walking it too. And together, without formal organization or explicit coordination, we're recovering something, remembering something, becoming something, not superhuman, just more fully human, accessing more of the extraordinary potential that ordinary biology contains when it's given attention, practice, and permission to develop in directions modern culture doesn't typically encourage. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. So rest now. Let these ideas settle into whatever understanding serves you. Let your body process what your mind has been considering. Let the vibrations of this story, because it has been vibration all along, words creating sound, creating resonance in your body as you listen. Let those vibrations find their natural place in your experience. And when you wake, maybe something will be different. Maybe nothing will be different. Either way, you'll have traveled. You'll have considered. You'll have opened yourself to possibilities that most people never even question. And that opening, that willingness to wonder, that capacity to engage with uncertainty and complexity and ancient mysteries, that itself is valuable. That itself makes you part of the solution to whatever challenges humanity faces. Because we need people who can think beyond conventional frameworks, who can integrate knowledge from multiple disciplines and cultures, who can hold past and future together, recognizing that both contain wisdom the present alone lacks. We need people who can listen, really listen, not just to words but to resonance, not just with ears but with whole bodies, not just to modern voices but to ancient echoes that still sound if you know how to perceive them. Maybe you're becoming that kind of person. Maybe you already were, and this story simply confirms something you've always known. Either way, thank you for listening, for staying, for engaging with ideas that don't come with easy answers, for being willing to wonder about who we were, who we are, who we might yet become. The conversation continues. In your thoughts, in your experiments, in your own exploration of what it means to be human in a world that vibrates with information we're only beginning to remember how to hear. Listen well, feel deeply, and maybe, just maybe, you'll hear something that changes everything. Something ancient, something true, something that was always there, waiting for you to remember. Good night, go gently, and wake to wonder.